Okay, we're live. Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we're gonna discuss the recent attacks by Israel on Iran, and we're gonna talk about those attacks. Jeremiah's gonna begin, and then after we have a discussion about what this means and where it's going, we'll give a preview of an interview that we recently did in Chicago with Student Minister Ishmael Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. And I think Doc will help give us a preview of that, which will be very important. And then finally, we'll talk about our upcoming Knowledge Symposium and read the vision statement for the Knowledge Symposium and preview some of those days. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jeremiah to begin the discussion.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, it's good to be back with everybody, but obviously, I feel like, yeah, things have happened really fast over the past couple of days. And, yeah, we've been talking about it, especially since yesterday. It's clear we're living in very dangerous times. And I know that we've said this before, but I wanted to stress that in free school, we are not like geopolitical analysts or commentators on podcasts or anything like that. But really what we are is, I would see us as partisans for peace and for humanity. And so that also means that we have a responsibility to know what's happening in the world. And I was thinking about it, just like, obviously, like there's a lot happening. And like, I think like even right now, like Israel and Iran are like exchanging missile barrages and waves of attacks. But I was thinking about it, and even for ourselves, like related to that, sometimes it's like almost like that we feel like we want two things simultaneously. At least I feel this way. And one of those things is that obviously we want justice for the Palestinian people. And I think many of us feel that especially at this point, will have to mean the dismantling of the state of Israel. And I think many of us really want Israel to actually finally face consequences for what it has done for the past year and a half. But then at the same time, like, and this is something that I've been feeling over the past like 2 days, but that at the same time we want peace, we don't want nuclear war, World War III. And it's not like those like impulses or desires are contradictory, but I think that it's like sometimes there's like, for me at least, there's like tension between those different desires. But I just wanted to start with that, and then just kind of go through like what we know and what's been happening. But obviously the big thing that we're talking about is that Israel, I think on Thursday, struck Iran, and this was, in the words that many people have used in the media, this was a decapitation strike against many of Iran's senior leadership. And the ultimate goal of this is regime change in Iran. And so some of the people that Israel killed included the commander-in-chief of the military, the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, multiple other kind of military Air Force commanders and leadership, and then also kind of like the group of nuclear scientists and physicists who are in Iran and part of Iran's nuclear program. There's also reports that, yeah, Israel has targeted the nuclear facilities in Iran, but it's unclear how much damage they've actually done against those facilities. And then, like I was just reading the New York Times today, and they were saying that Israel has also, as part of this, damaged Iran's kind of defense capabilities, as well as their kind of ballistic missile systems. And I guess within all of that, like obviously there's like the factual things that we know, but also part of this is the propaganda war as well, which I think is important to keep in mind, which is that obviously it benefits the Israeli side to kind of say like, oh, like this was a total victory, to play up their own achievements. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. And that's also true on the Iranian side too, I think. And right now it seems like they've definitely taken out significant figures and commanders within like the leadership of the Iranian state, but I don't think that they've totally incapacitated the actual command structure of the Iranian military or even its scientific infrastructure. I think that is kind of remains to be seen. And I think the biggest thing and the most obvious thing, at least for me in all this, is why did this happen, and how did this failure of particularly Iranian intelligence and defense, how did it happen? And obviously, at least, yeah, especially from, if I feel like if you're like me and you're very active on social media and Twitter, like part of, I think what makes this worse is that Iran has talked such a big game over the past several months, and been, there's, I think, what they call like Operation True Promise, earlier or later last year, in which they sent some missiles over to Israel, but they've really been talking, I feel like they have been talking a very big game over the past couple months. And so that makes it worse, I think, especially for how it looks on, Khamenei, the kind of supreme leader of Iran, and then as well as Iranian leadership. But what I've been seeing, at least in like New York Times and Wall Street Journal and Financial Times, is that part of why this happened is that, Israel has been saying very openly, like, we're going to attack you. And they've been making a lot of noise about this. But it seems like the fundamental miscalculation that Iran has made is that they basically thought Israel was bluffing, at least until there were supposed to be scheduled talks between Iran and the United States this upcoming Sunday over kind of nuclear negotiations. And so Iran's basic calculus was that Israel wouldn't hit them negotiations on Sunday. And I think that was a big miscalculation on their part. And also, yeah, like I think the bigger thing that is revealed by this is how colossal of an intelligence failure this was for Iran, especially given, like, and this is a thing that like really makes me, I don't know, like it really bothers me, but it's like for the past, especially like 2 years, Israel has openly kind of laid out what its modus operandi is and how it rolls, which is basically, yeah, to do assassinations. They killed, Sinwar, they killed Nasrallah. They did these like that pager terrorist attack in Lebanon. The Iranian president died last year under very mysterious circumstances, which was maybe the Israelis were involved. And so it's like part of what is so confounding about this is that Israel has shown this is the way that we operate. And for Iran to not be prepared for basically that kind of attack, especially those kinds of decapitation attempts, to me is very confounding and confusing, like why they weren't prepared for this. And I think the other aspect, which I think many people have brought up, is that Israeli intelligence at this point clearly has infiltrated very deep into the Iranian state and Iranian leadership. There's also reports that Israel like actually set up like little drone operation sites within Iran itself in order to make this attack happen. And I think where Iran is now is basically, yeah, like engaged in a kind of existential fight for the survival of its state. So I feel like that's kind of like the main things that I've been seeing related to Iran. But then obviously the other side of this is Trump too, and the United States. And so at this point, Trump has openly admitted that he knew that this attack was going to happen beforehand. But him and Marco Rubio have claimed that the U.S. was quote unquote not involved in the Israeli attack, which honestly, like this is just me, but I think that's bullshit. And I think the Iranians and most of the world will call it that. Especially because like even right now, it's like U.S. air defense systems, naval destroyers are all basically working to defend Israel against Iran's kind of retaliatory missiles. And the U.S. is moving like these aircraft fleets, these aircraft carriers around the region to defend Israel. And to me, yeah, it's obvious that the U.S. wasn't just notified, but they had to give the green light to Israel because Israel needs American protection. And like it can't just do it with the Iron Dome. And I think something that many people have pointed out is that it's clearly also in Netanyahu's interest to start a war with Iran and to basically break any possibility of negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. And that I think Netanyahu's main goal is to try to pull the U.S. into a war and to basically take down what Israel sees as its main enemy in the region, which is Iran. And I think for me, that like the conclusion I've come to is, especially related to Trump, is that either Trump has been willingly coordinating with the Israelis this whole time and basically tricking the Iranians with these negotiations to try to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security, or Trump. So like there's one, like either Trump has been in on this whole time, or Trump, the other option is that Trump was pressured kind of last minute by his own people as well as by Netanyahu to kind of go along with this plan to strike Iran. One thing that actually Scott Ruder has pointed out is that because Iran was engaging in these nuclear negotiations with the US and also Europe, that kind of exposed who are the key personnel within Iran's leadership, and especially related to their nuclear program. And it also has exposed like more of like where's like the critical infrastructure for the nuclear stuff. And so I think that's part of it too. And I think, I think especially for Trump though, like in either case, like whether he's been in on it the whole time or if he was kind of pressured last minute into this, I think both of those are very damning for Trump. And either it means that he's like actually totally just evil, or basically just like inept and powerless to do anything, and that he's essentially at the whim of all of these other forces within the kind of US and Israeli state apparatus. And I think actually this morning Iran basically said that, we have no reason to negotiate with the US at this point. And so they canceled the talks that were scheduled for this Sunday. And like honestly, from their position is like, why would you have any reason to trust Trump himself, but also the United States in any kind of negotiations? And in a way, like similar dynamics, I feel like have been playing out with regards to Russia and Ukraine too. But obviously for Trump, the big thing is that, he ran, if there was like one major promise of his campaign, it was that he said, I'm going to prevent World War III. And where we're at now is that Russia-Ukraine has arguably gotten worse in terms of the military conflict. Israel, there was the ceasefire negotiations that have been kind of off and on, but the whole time, basically throughout that whole time, Israel has been suffocating and starving Palestinians in Gaza, slaughtering them in these massacres. And then now, obviously, there's the kind of looming prospect of an all-out war, not just between Israel and Iran, but also between with the US involved. And the other dimension to this, especially domestically, is that I think we talked about this yesterday, but just that if anything, I think it could like the prospect of war with Iran could be the kind of rock that essentially breaks apart the MAGA coalition. And very publicly, people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens have come out very like vocally in complete opposition to what Trump is doing, as well as calling out the kind of all of the neocons and Zionists who surround Trump and are kind of pressuring him, egging him on to like kind of be in tandem with Israel and to wage war against Iran. So I think that's kind of the part of the domestic dimension of this. And then the other things that obviously have been happening is that Iran has hit back against Israel. And it's kind of, it's very unclear at this point, like what the extent of damage has been. There's been reports that Iran has struck the kind of main military command center in Tel Aviv, and kind of like the equivalent of like the Israeli Pentagon. And I think for me, and then I think obviously for people in Gaza and around the world, I think like just the sight of the kind of Iranian missiles striking Tel Aviv and striking Israel has been very incredible, especially just seeing the Israelis get what is essentially like a taste of their own medicine after a year and a half of kind of operating with complete impunity and destroying all of Gaza, leveling Gaza. But that being said, it's like, like we're at a point where there's kind of waves of missile exchanges between both Israel and Iran. And like, I think that this is likely to continue to escalate. And I guess another dimension is that this has given more justification for calls, especially within Iran, to essentially take the same route as a country like North Korea and essentially to proceed with developing nuclear weapons. as a safeguard against kind of the insanity of Israel in the West. Like it's unclear exactly what will happen and like what will the consequences of that be. And I think just like I don't know, this is just what I'm seeing, which is very limited, but I think a lot of what happens in the next couple of weeks will really depend on what kind of warfare Iran wants to wage and for how long. And yeah, like I was reading this article by Scott Ritter earlier this morning, but Ritter's argument is that for Iran, the only way forward for them is to hit Israel so hard and to essentially try to destroy Israel that Israel would have to beg the US to step in and broker a peace deal, which I don't know how likely that is. I feel like this has exposed Iran so much and exposed the kind of not just the miscalculation, but the weakness within the Iranian leadership, and also their ability to kind of coordinate a regional response to Israel, like in terms of the axis of resistance. And then I think for me, the larger questions are going to be, like, what will be the economic fallout of this? What will be the political fallout of this? How will the darker world respond, especially the BRICS nations? And I think this is just like my kind of interpretation, but like part of what I feel like is at play is that the US and Israel benefit from the fact that I think leaders in the darker world, especially the Arab states, are not united or not completely united, especially in taking more concrete and harder actions against the Zionist regime. And at the same time, like, Iran has also been constrained domestically by its own kind of internal divisions within its society, definitely by the sanctions imposed by the US, and also with their desire to not have to enter full-scale war with the United States. And I think, it has part of that too, is I think the concern, at least for Iran, that like they wouldn't be able to draw the kind of support they would need from allies if they were to launch, like earlier before all this happened, like, if they had launched what looked like, quote unquote, an unprovoked attack on Israel, I think Iran would have been concerned that they wouldn't be able to draw the kind of support that they need from, especially allies from like the BRICS nations, but also within the region. But I don't know. There's a lot I feel like that is happening, and I'm not fully confident in making definitive statements because it's so early, and it remains to be seen what's going to happen in terms of the kind of escalation of war. But like we say in free school all the time, I think the kind of unseen or incalculable factor in all this is how much of this depends on what we've said in terms of the resolve and the consciousness of people, and especially here in the U.S. to press against the call for the U.S. to get involved, or at least for the U.S. to escalate its involvement in a war situation. But I don't know. That's kind of what I've been seeing, and obviously it's a very fraught and dangerous time. But that's kind of what I wanted to say.
I just looked at a headline in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and it said that Netanyahu told the Iranians he will be flying Israeli jets over Tehran. That is literally saying that you cannot even defend your capital. Not missiles, not drones, but jets. Obviously, this is a regime change operation. Of course, it is very dangerous. I was reading, like Jerry, the New York Times and the Financial Times this morning until I couldn't read anymore. It just became very sickened by the whole thought. First of all, in the New York Times, they literally say that the Iranian regime had been completely infiltrated by the Western intelligence and Israeli Mossad, which is to say that there are elements in the Iranian state and in the Iranian military that are loyal to the goals of regime change. I mean, who would have ever thought that? The other thing is what the Financial Times and the New York Times are saying, and I don't think this is triumphalism or just propaganda. I think they know what they're talking about here. That Iran has been almost disarmed. It cannot defend itself. The fact that they could only muster 100 missiles to throw into Israel, and most of them were shot down. What about the 2,000 that I thought you said you had? Something is wrong in the Iranian state, that they were so unprepared and so miscalculated that even their top military people who were warned by Israel, we're going to attack you, we're going to do this, were walking around like it was just another day in the park, rather than going to secure locations. If you would have asked me, I know Jared didn't want to say it, but just from my point of view, I have a sense of the worst case scenario. In other words, Israel can assassinate the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, whenever they get ready. And there was some indication of this back last year when they killed one of the leading people of Hamas, the inaugural ceremony of the new president. I mean, how does that happen? And the fact that that Iran is always saying what they're going to do, but never quite do it. You know, the indecisiveness, and in fact, they were more prepared 8 months ago or more than they were this time around. The other thing is, in terms of the U.S. political situation, yes, Trump ran as a peace candidate. Yes, most of MAGA want peace. You know what I'm saying? We'll come back to that in a minute. Well, I'll say it right now. There's an article in the Financial Times this morning, saying that if the United States gets involved with a war with Iran, it will split MAGA. I mean, way beyond Tucker Carlson and Candace Owen. I mean, really split it. Already, it is obvious that this is not what people voted for. He is a traitor. And he has been captured by the neocons. And I think we should understand who the neocons are politically. The neocons, and they named themselves that in the early 1990s, were a highly influential and powerful group of intellectuals within the Defense Department, within the State Department, within the institutions of U.S. foreign policy, within universities, in fact, and within think tanks. The neocons, at least the originary figures, are people who come out of the Trotskyist movement. You can do your Google, look it up, neocons and Trotskyists. They were Trotskyists. They took Trotsky's notion of permanent revolution, which, by the way, for Trotsky also meant permanent war, to achieve revolution. they took that and made it into the concept of permanent war. However, there are personal characteristics that we cannot overlook. One, almost all of the originary figures are Jewish. All of them have a ancestry going back to Russia. So they were Russian Jews who, quote, fled Russia or the Soviet Union. So they carry a deep hatred, first of the Soviet Union, now of Russia. But then the mix becomes even more toxic when you connect to all of this toxicity, Zionism. And it is this, it is these political networks of ideas.
Right.
Ideas again. The ideas and the networks that have captured the Trump government, or Trump, because it's not much of a government. Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, Rubio, it's not much of a government. And hence, to capture Trump is to capture the government, the administration. And I don't think there's any way, I think like you told me, Jerry, Tucker, who was a passionate supporter of Trump in 2024, is now calling him a liar and a betrayer, and he is. But the other thing it points out to me is that the US state and its main ideological political agents are enormously powerful. You're not going to just, blow on them or shout slogans at them and they're going to retreat. Nor is it the case with Israel. As fragile as that government is, and that's the government, but the Israeli state that is propped up by the United States and other Western governments, not only propped up, but is inseparable from the US state. Inseparable, literally. It's not just an ally, it is an organic part of. So now the candidate of peace has become the candidate of war and a betrayal of the people. This is a profound lesson. And I think in free school we were probably absolutely right when we talked about the changes in the American people, less racist, more pro-peace, less for war, and that the vote for Trump in large measure was an anti-war. We don't want war anymore. Vote. You know what I'm saying? And that shows a very positive development among the American people. But they could not, to elect a president is not to change the state. So you get the equation. It's just one small thing I want to say. I feel, and Shantanu and I kind of texting back and forth about this. It is not, this is a very dark development. Very dark development. If the Iranian state falls, if there is regime change, it not only alters the so-called Middle East, but it alters global politics. Because Iran, let's not forget, is a major member of the BRICS. It is a major member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is connected in important ways to Russia, China, and North Korea, and so on. Obviously, the model for this thing of, infiltrating Iran and making the drones that you will shoot at their missile and air forces and airports is very similar to what they did in Russia, and it is very clear that the Ukraine war is not a war for Ukraine as much as a war for regime change in Russia. And one hopes that the Russian state is secure. We do not know. We do not know. In a certain sense, Putin's hesitancy, Medvedev's outspokenness suggest a major political split. You know who Medvedev is, right? He was the former president after Putin's second term. Putin had to step down. Medvedev became the president. He served 2 terms, in which Putin was the prime minister. Then Putin comes back. Medvedev was the prime minister for a while. Now he's a high official in the state. Putin has been, some would say, too cautious. Seems that has changed. But sometimes you have to ask, why all this cautiousness? You have the enemy on the ropes. Why don't you finish the job? You're taking too long. You're giving them too much time. The same thing with Iran. I thought you had all this going on. Why don't you go ahead? That's what me and Jerry were talking about. Why don't you go ahead and do what you have to do? They kill 100 of your people, and you say, well, I'm going to avoid hitting civilians. I'm just hitting milk. Well, sometimes you got to have eye for an eye. You know what I'm saying? An eye for an eye. And they seem to fear taking it to that point, which, again, now that we know about the high level of infiltration, not only did they not want a war with the United States, they didn't want to do what they said, all hell's going to break down. Zionist regime will go up in flames and all that. That was just talk, and that's what Jerry and see, the thing is, the regime in Iran thus face a crisis of legitimacy, because you're talking all that to the Iranian people, and they're believing it. You know what I'm saying? And suddenly it's discovered that it's a fraud. The other thing is the podcasters. We all listen to podcasts for an alternative source of information and analysis. Well, now we know. A lot of big willy talk, a lot of performance. I don't know what Professor Morandi at this point does. Because he was assuring everybody that Iran's missile defenses were impenetrable, the best in the world, that Iran could deliver a knockout blow to the Israeli state, that it was Israel that was in the weaker position, not Iran. Well, it turns out everything was the opposite to what he said. I won't even mention Pepe Escobar, Danny Haifa, and all the rest of them. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of, we really do have to say at this point that it is a clown show. And they're more interested in their getting hits and being seen than in the truth. Was the podcasters misled a lot of people who were looking, for that alternative. I'll just end on this. I'm going to talk about our interview with Ishmael Muhammad after this portion. The positive thing is the American people. The American people, and we've had it right for several years, the American people are war exhausted. They do not want war. Today, there are going to be the No Kings demonstrations all over the country, which is nothing but a deep state kind of regime change operation. And that seems ironic, right? Why would the regime or part of the regime support a regime change against Trump? Isn't he doing everything they want him to do? Yes, he is. But still, he is not who they want. And so all of this, the LA uprisings, the LA marches, and they're very small. I mean, all of the press and media they get. In fact, just to be clear, the mainstream media is the organizing center of the whole thing. Not even the what do we call the nonprofits, which are a network. Not even the Democrats, but it is the media that is the organizing center of these demonstrations. The corporate media, not so much it seems the alternative media, but the corporate media. I learned recently that Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, has been involved for many years with the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, who is the National Endowment for Democracy? It is, in a lot of ways, it took over a part of CIA operations in the 1990s. What part of CIA operations did they take over? The soft power operations. So soft power and distraction, distraction, misdirection is a part of this whole thing. So, but frankly, unless something happens differently than I suspect. Now, Emily says, oh, this is going to be a huge demonstration. I said, Emily, what do you call huge? Oh, a couple thousand. I said, that's not huge, but maybe if that's all they can do, and if they do not show signs of moving the working class, the poor, and especially Black Philadelphia, it's a failure. It's a performance. But nonetheless, I'm going to end here. The question of peace, the question of actual democracy, and for so many like ourselves, and so many who don't agree with us ideologically. I mean, we're where we're at, and I'm not certain that they disagree with us that much, by the way, because we have not taken this, quote, hard leftist position. If the people want peace, if the people want democracy, if the people want a better life, an actual better life, we're all on the same page and we can all move together. With these demonstrations, no. I, just my own personal predilection is to stay as far away from them as possible. Because, I see it and I just can't move myself to be a part of movements that are organized by the deep state. I don't care what they claim they're doing. and so on. I'll stop there.
Well, like what Jeremiah said, I'm also still just processing it, make sense of
Speak
it.
up a little bit.
Um, yeah, well, I agree with what you said about the podcasters. That's something I was thinking about also. I've also spent some time listening to them. And yeah, it is unrealistic. Um, Kind of their expectations, and we were always being told for the past several months that the state is going to the Israeli state will give up at any point, it's going to collapse at any point. And something you said, I think, is important, that even if the government of Israel has to reform its coalition and kind of reshape itself, and that's not stable, the state and honestly, I think the Israeli people at this point, there's a lot more that needs to be done before it can be, because there's still a lot of support, I think, in Israel for the kinds of things that, and a lot of people say, well, Netanyahu and so on, but I think that has nothing to do with what they're doing with Iran and what they're doing in Palestine. Um, I think, yeah, I agree that it is shocking what happened to the Iranian leadership, and yet you're right, when they knew this could happen, when it had already been done in their guest house to have a Palestinian leader assassinated. Um, I don't know. I guess the only way to see it is what you're saying, that it's just such a deep level of infiltration. Because I can't believe that they're naive or they're just so. I mean, to think that you would have good faith negotiations, and to think that, oh, they're not going to attack today, they'll attack after the next round of negotiations. I mean, that does seem. I mean, you have to be prepared in a situation like that. And I don't think the Israelis have ever hidden what they're capable of. And that's, what I was saying, that I think in a usual war, I mean, this is not in a usual war, you never start by attacking the leadership.
Yeah.
Because that means that there's no scope for negotiation after the war is over, because the leadership is the one that negotiates. So Israel is not conducting a war. This is, um, yeah, regime change operation, and it's. I think what you're saying about the relationship between U.S. and Israel, that's really something, because it's almost not under question. Even under Trump, it's not under question that if Iran attacks back or Iran does anything, that the US will have to come and support. There's no even debate about it. I mean, JD Vance is not saying anything about it, or it's not all of this group of people around Trump who are supposed to be anti-war. They're not questioning this, that if Iran attacks Israel, we have to be there. And it's almost like if they attack Israel, they're attacking us. It's an unquestioned kind of a principle of American policy. In fact, even more than, it's almost sometimes you feel the attack on Israel is more than even attack on the United States would be. And yeah, it's the and to your last point, I think about. I think, and one of the reasons that we really wanted to visit this year was really to get a sense of what's happening, because the first few months of the Trump administration just had so much going on, and for a moment there, it seemed like he was really trying to take on the American state in the way he treated Zelensky, that he was really going to make changes to the American, or that he could make. It seemed for a moment that he was making a serious impact on the American state. He had all these people he had appointed, like Tulsi and Kash Patel and so on. But I guess this really reflects on the weaknesses of how Trump has kind of conducted his presidency, and the weaknesses of basically he's really not consolidated. he's too erratic. He's always trying to, one day he's saying this, one day he's saying that. He's trying to bring all sorts of forces together. He's really not consolidated, and that yeah, at this point he appears very weak, and he appears like he's not going to be able to do any of the things he came on. He's not going to be able to implement the tariffs. And the biggest question of peace, I mean, at this point, it really seems like the US is going to get dragged into a long war in that region. But yeah, I mean, I do, well, that's what we were discussing before the preschool, that I do think that Iran still has a few cards that it can play, including shutting down the Straits of Hormuz and the possibility of, which is pretty much the only lesson, to be the possibility of building a nuclear bomb, which some people are saying that we're pretty close to. But which strike is the only deterrence against this kind of attack. But if they don't have a consolidated ideological leadership in Iran, I mean, none of this will make that much of a difference because they're not going to be able to hold on to their state. And yeah, so I guess I'll just say that.
I just wanted to, on this question of whether the response, I think most of what Doc, Jeremiah, and Raju said, all of it, like, it makes sense. It paints a very dire picture because last November with Trump's election, I think there was hope, but there was an optimism about, basically how the American people were moving and this idea that this change or, the defeat of the Democrats and Biden and Kamala Harris could open up opportunities. But now, given what all of the stuff that Raju was also pointing out about the first few months of Trump's presidency, and then now, and this really, like, at the scale of actual war already having broken up, I think more and more it's becoming clear that the solution or the true path to peace does not really come from a change in, like, the government, even in this country. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and this is maybe just a question I have, and I think both you, Doc, and Jeremiah raised this about a certain insufficiency in Iran's response to what happened. And I think I just want to ask a question about it because I feel like it can be, it does feel very cautious, but I think I have questions about how far could Iran really go in its retaliation right now, given that, I think the obvious implication is that immediately brings the US into the conflict in defense of Israel. So, I mean, even in thinking about whether this was a sufficient response or not, I'm seeing, or at least I have seen, the way Iran responds as different from, or a little more cautious, because the possibility of all-out war is not as acceptable maybe to the Iranians as it would be to the Israelis or the US. So I just wanted to point that out because I think I'm confused about, how far realistically it could have gone in its retaliation at this moment.
Well, I just wanted to say that I think the ways in which the American state and the American ruling elite infiltrate governments and states all over the world is more subtle and sophisticated today than possibly ever before. And, last year we were discussing this idea of a white supremacist social system. I think part of what has weakened a state like Iran is the presence of people who are, I guess, ideologically westward looking in their thought. It doesn't even have to be necessarily people who are paid by the CIA. It has to be just, and I think a large part of that is actually the Iranian American community in this country, which retains its links to Iran. And in a lot of cases, the elite of Iran, the people who immigrate to the US and pretty much like, I guess, are liberals, are neocon liberals, and want regime change in Iran, Iranians who want regime change in Iran. And I think it's true of, I think it's true of also a nation like India, although in a, I guess a softer way, but definitely Iran. And so I think that, that struggle of ideas for clarity in ideas is so important in this time. Yeah, the other thing is this, the idea that the US state and Israel are linked symbiotically. I think that's very important. I think we need to talk about that more. Because, like you were saying, Doc, the role of the American people extends not only in this country, but all over the world. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say was this, that I think the Israeli people, I think we have to say that the Israeli people have consented to all of this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I think they're, pretty much consenting to a Nazi project, and I think a question has to be raised about their social, their social character, their moral character. And I think you've said before, Doc, that the state, the fact that they have a state, I think has to be in question, whether they should be allowed to have a state by the world's people. After this. So, yeah, that's what I want to say.
I think it was the speech by Louis Farrakhan 2 years ago, and he recommended the book about Israeli secret intelligence agencies, Rise and Kill First by Ron Bergman. So I was unpacking my books and I found that. But at my work, people were admiring Mossad for, because after every operation, they have to brag about how sophisticated it was. But there's so many things that they can't brag about because they're a intelligence agency. And, I was thinking about, sort of the attitude toward Iran and Mossad at my work. And it occurred to me that, Epstein was a Mossad operation. And, all these secret organizations like the FBI and the CIA and Mossad and Shin Bet who operate on secrets and traffic children so that they can blackmail politicians and princes. That's not, and we as the world's people shouldn't tolerate organizations like that. And that's why I was so excited for Kash Patel, because I thought, okay, he's not my guy, he's a conservative, but he's gonna purge the FBI, but he's not panned out the way, I basically think he's a bitch now. Chill. But yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's true. And then the other book that Minister Farrakhan recommended in that speech was We Charge Genocide by Paul Robeson. And if I could actually add one more thing, you were mentioning the media class and their role in all this, and how in every Hollywood movie like Black Panther, the CIA is the good guys. I just can't. They're not the good guys. No organization.
Can I just ask you one question? I know we have to, but how do you see the podcast universe these days? With all of their hits, with all of their so-called views, how do you view them? Not just from the hits thing, but the political universe that they have created.
I think that along with the Indian aircraft crash, that anyone that says that they know what's going on doesn't know what's going on. They definitely don't.
That's what I've.
No, and it's a lot. The people on these podcasts are just, you don't really know who they are. You don't know where they live. You don't know who they're accountable to. They always claim they're in touch with all of these high officials in Russia and all of these, in Turkey, and they always have inside news, but they can't disclose their sources. And I mean, at this point, it's just gossip. They're just gossiping on their podcast, claiming they really have some sensitive information and they know exactly what, oh, it's some big news, I can't reveal it. I just heard it from some minister in the Russian. And it's, totally unaccountable. And there are questions on how they're able to travel this much and what their funding sources are. And it's, I think they have misled a lot of people, and they should be straight up and apologize. They should really say that we got this wrong. But I don't think they'll do that. I think they'll kind of keep going, and I think a lot of it has to do with the way the social media and podcast world operates, where kind of none of this matters, and you just have it's all about how many hits you have, it's all about how many new followers you can get, and I don't even know if these issues matter to them enough, because ultimately I think I think a lot of these are just isolated individuals, and you have to be grounded in something. You have to be grounded in like, I don't want, but Pepe Escobar, now he's supposed to be Brazilian. I don't know if he's ever in Brazil. I don't know if anyone in Brazil knows him, honestly. But yeah, he's a world journalist who everybody in the West knows, and at least the West and left, not everybody, but a section of the West. I mean, Vijay Prashad, like, he's not as high up as it, but he has his own set of operation, and I mean, him for a fact, I know that in India. I don't think he ever comes there. I think these are quite irresponsible individuals, and the reason they're able to operate like this is because there's nobody to hold them accountable.
To me, it was a hard pill to swallow when you said that all the signs are that Trump has been captured by the neocons. And the specificity with which you said, like, because in some ways, Rajan and I were having this conversation earlier about over breakfast, because these are the topics we talk about over breakfast. About like, Raju was like, "Can you define the state to me?" And I was like, I did the classic thing where I was like, I can feel what it is, but I can't define it. But basically, I think this question of how important it is to understand that the things you see in the news or the things we talk about, everything, especially in America, there is a state that is not so easily defeated. It doesn't just disintegrate over time. Because in some ways you have this assumption that you're like, Trump's election was his election was something against the state.
Yeah.
But him now in governance, and now the Trump administration as governance, not necessarily the state, is still in battle with the state. And in fact, what Nanito was saying about the way the state operates is much more sophisticated.
Yeah.
It lingers, and it's much stronger than you realize. And that even Trump himself has been recaptured, like the way you defined it it's not like there are just a few people, but actually, in fact, it's a network of ideas that seep into so much of what basically, in some ways, guides like operations of society and operations of like foreign policy and individuals, and even shapes individuals. And at this point, you could say even like it's one and parcel with the Zionist state of Israel. So I think it was kind of a hard pill for me to swallow this morning, that Trump has been captured by the neocons, and to say like, who are the neocons? Well, they're highly influential intellectuals who still are still in the mix. And there's also a state that we don't even completely understand how it operates and in what fashion. And I think that was the significance of the way we defined the last knowledge symposium, to say that the state, the university, is not just an innocent third party to everything, but in fact it is part of the state, and should be treated as such, or else we allow ourselves and the people to be allowed to be distracted by many forms of distraction. Like both, like what the media, like even the way you're saying the media at this point, the corporate media is an organizing force. It's not a, like, you know, this whole idea of journalism is reporting on the facts, whatever. That actually the corporate media is essentially an organizing force, as much distracting the American people and manufacturing human action in a certain way, human thought, as much as the No Kings rally today is a distracting force in the face of the fact that most of the American people are tired of it. And in some ways, all of the distraction is meant to distract the American people from what is a very common feeling or a common condition, which is the American people across race, especially among the poor, are much more similar to each other in terms of how they feel and who they think the enemy is, which is like, they do not like the ruling elite. They're very angry at deindustrialization. In a lot of ways, they act the same. They either do not vote. They either do not vote, or they vote for who they think is a rebellious, it's non-establishment candidate. And like in some ways, there's just many forms of distraction preventing the struggle for clarity that brings the people together. But yeah, I don't know. For some reason, it kind of did impact. It was a tough, like, yeah, it was just a tough pill to swallow in assessing Trump, and how in some ways there was a hope, him as like an anti-state figure, in some ways kind of like the head of a movement that is acting very much like against the state, has been captured by a certain network of ideas that also is like basically directly related to the state of Israel, and has infiltrated Iran. And yeah, and another thing was, I haven't made sense of it, but I think it's pretty deep, the way you phrased, why is the regime doing a regime change protest, like the No Kings rally, right? Like this rally, the reason why I'm paying attention to the rally today is because, unlike others, it is so obviously a deep state operation. It is. Actually, you identified why I'm so interested in it. It is a deep state protest in the name of a grassroots people's movement against, you know, Trump as a fascist, rather than against Trump as someone who's supporting war, right? They're not saying, oh, we're rallying the people against Trump as someone who's supporting Israel's attacks against Iran, but rather Trump as a fascist, anti-people, like, figure. And you know it's a deep state operation when you have the heiress of the Walmart fortune putting a full-page New York Times ad in support, driving people to come to this rally. Like, you can't get any more like suspicious than that. And I've never seen the amount of organizing of all the nonprofits and labor unions. Like, I literally had a Facebook group of American-born Chinese, the most random Facebook group, versus the West Philadelphia community Facebook group, both posting the exact same message: everyone come to the No Kings rally. Like, neither of those have anything to do with each other. American-born Chinese community group and like national group, and then West Philadelphia neighborhood Facebook group. And I think there is, yeah, what you said. Why is the regime doing a regime change protest against Trump, who's doing what they want? Like, I don't know. So that was, I'm trying to make sense, but to me that was actually pretty deep. Because it also does say something about, like, maybe I'm just naive and I always am just looking for the silver lining, but I do think we're at a moment where the American people, there is a lot of potential in the American people who have never been closer, because they're people forever changed by essentially King in the anti-war, pro-peace, pro-democracy demand of the American people. And there are people who do not want to go to war. And I know it's not questionable that America will support Israel, but it was interesting. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene was like, I know you shouldn't take any of these people too seriously, but yeah, it was interesting where she tweeted. She was like, I really do not think we should. I really don't think whatever Israel does is our war. Like we should not support whatever they do in Iran. And I just think there is that at the end of the day, there is a necessity for both the clarity, for like ideological clarity, despite all the distractions, but also like, I don't know how to describe it, but I just think there's something important about what we're doing with free school, and in particular, how to assess also the American people.
Yeah, I feel like part of what I've also been thinking about, we've been trying to just kind of fine tune and update the vision statement and call for the knowledge symposium. And part of that is like even trying to, it's really small stuff, but even just trying to calibrate like the language in a way to like actually try to capture like what's happening, like where the people are at, like what is the zeitgeist, like where are we? And I think, yeah, definitely even going back to the podcast conversation, like even for myself for sure, because like my main sources of news are like, yeah, like the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, New York Times, and then supplementing that with like the podcasting people, because yeah, like it's very hard to find like information about the world in general. And I think I've definitely had like, it's like it's really easy to develop a kind of inflated sense of things and like where we're at, and like both in relation to the Trump stuff, but even yeah, like so much of the model of like, yeah, like the podcast people is like Iran is going to decimate Israel, and like you need to put that in like the headline, and it needs to be really eye-catching, and the thumbnail, like the visual thumbnail needs to be very like extreme, and like everyone's just trying to outdo each other with how maximalist and extreme claims they can make. And I feel like it does kind of like, when you're listening to it a lot, it can really inflate or kind of distort your sense of like actually what's happening. And yeah, I feel like I've definitely struggled with that because yeah, like again, it's very hard to find information. But I think the other part of it too, which like I feel like I've been focused on, and like I feel like we're trying to capture even like the vision statement for the symposium, is like when you have a breakdown of the kind of dominant ideological consensus in society, it necessarily means that it opens up essentially this like battle of like narratives, of ideologies, of ideas, but even just understanding like reality, if that makes sense. Like this is all like part of the consequence of a breakdown of a civilization in which everything becomes on the table. And in a positive way, it means that the people are much more ready to say like, no, actually, I don't believe you when you tell me these things. This is what I think reality is. But it also means that it's going to be much more confusing for people to actually try to identify what's really happening, either within their own society or in the world. And I think this is also like, for me, in a very concrete sense, what we mean when we talk about the battle of ideas, the ideological struggle, the struggle for clarity. And yeah, I mean, but also to the question that Colbert raised earlier, like what options does Iran have?
Yeah.
Like I do think that's a good. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because it is like, I think yes, like Iran has like it has been exposed in terms of the weakness of the state and infiltration by U.S. and Israeli and Western intelligence, but I think yeah, like I do think part of it too is that whether it's like the Ayatollah or other parts of the Iranian leadership, like for me, the primary reason for their caution is they don't want to get dragged into like a full war with the United States. And I think that takes certain things maybe off the table for them. But yeah, I do think it's a good.
Well, if I can just add one thing, I think I'm also thinking about Trump and, I guess how to understand him in this time. And I think part of why they're still against him, even though he has folded in many ways is because of this contradiction that he has with the universities. And I think he's really hitting on something that's deep in the center of all of how the system is run. Because even, I mean, what I was saying before, I mean, ultimately, it's human beings that run these governments, and it's human beings that, conduct trade and conduct militaries. And if you can convince somebody that the American military may be bad, but there's some worth in the civilizational force, then they become weak, in the force of a challenge. I mean, it's not that they have to fight you, they just don't have to resist. That's the only thing. And I think that that's what I mean, they've perfected this. You come here, you be trained in these universities, you go back, you run your state, and you don't have to fight them. You don't have to be anti-American. You just don't have to resist. That's the only thing. So I think he's really,
No, you're right.
I think the question is what he's going to do with these, with this contradiction he has with the universities. But yeah, I think that's part of it. Definitely. Yeah.
Interesting.
No, I think that's what Mehta is saying. I think that's how they got Iran, really.
Yeah.
I think I would say close to half. I don't know the numbers, but I think a significant proportion of the Iranian population is very westernized. You can see it in the Iranians you meet abroad.
Yeah.
I mean, they hate their government in a way that I've not seen any population. It's just, and I think the leadership of Iran has been unable to fight that ideological battle with the American universities to be able to consolidate hold over their own people. There's still too many people in Iran who look up to the West, who look up to Western universities, Western society, Western mannerisms, and they haven't been able to, they haven't been able to fight that. And that blow was much more than anything, if you have people on the inside, you can just turn off your air defense systems. I mean, you don't need anything else. And they've managed to get a lot of the people on the inside.
Do you mind if we go to the interview and then I think we'll come back to these questions? Because I think, another thing, Roger, you all dropped a bomb. Could it be this attack upon the elite universities is the red line that they cannot allow to be crossed? We'll come back to that.
I like what you guys are saying. Do you think it's a culture? Do you think that's what's breeding the influence? Western culture. It's very powerful.
Yeah.
Women's liberation, it's like a conflict of values.
I think more than that, I mean, the way I would say it is that I think it's an ideological struggle for what the future for humankind should look like. And whether it should look like, New York, or whether people should have the freedom to decide,
But we're going to come back to that when we get to the knowledge conference. This is very much at the core of it. We really have to read two mission statements or tweak it. I just want to report back on our trip, well, at least me and Michelle's trip to Chicago and our interview with Minister Ishmael Muhammad. Let me just start with something that occurred before the interview. And that was when I arrived in Chicago last Sunday. It was a beautiful day, and Johan and Neha and Meghna picked me up at the airport. Neha wasn't there, but we met at a coffee shop in Hyde Park around the University of Chicago. And, we're just, chilling, talking. And Meghna asked me a question. And I think it is a question that is part of the way we understand our attempts to understand the American people. And she asked, I mean, I don't know whether there was anything in our conversation which led to this question. She asked me if I believed that religious oriented movements were more effective than secular movements. And without thinking about it very much at all, I mean, I just said, no, religious based organizations are more effective. That does, and I didn't say this, but I would hasten to add now that, and I'm not saying secular organizations have no place in the architecture of people's movements. But I guess to put it another way, it is very difficult for any movement to take hold if it is not also connected to the religious organizations and movements of the people, especially if you're talking about Black people. And, you know, I think as we went into the interview, we were all armed with the book Black Gods of the Metropolis. And whether everybody had read it or not, at least the title suggests a great deal sociologically. And so we felt going into the interview, well, frankly, we didn't know what to expect. I mean, we expected to be treated friendly and politely, and we were. The Nation of Islam is a highly disciplined, highly organized organization with a profound worldview and ideology, which in many ways has withstood the test of time. I want to just say a little bit about, I don't want to say what's all in the interview. I know Albert and Chris and other people are transcribing it now. And as we edit it for publication, I have certain suggestions, but I'll say right now. You know, Minister Ishmael is a theologian, philosopher, and leader of a religious movement. He is also the son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. We'll talk about that. But I think what we present, and I think this issue of avant-garde is just going to be spectacular, dedicated to Muhammad Ali, with this interview, or really conversation with Ishmael Muhammad, who his character is deep and elevated. He is a human being that any of us could easily trust and want to be around. I think that's, you know, that's how we could do 6 hours of being together. And we were together in a very intimate way. It's so interesting. On the second day, we came into Mosque Miriam. We were early, and so we were sitting at the back of the auditorium, and in walks Minister Ishmael and 2 young people, and the woman was obviously dressed for a wedding. And right there before our eyes, he performed the wedding of these 2 young people. And of course, no one made a big thing of us being there. I mean, we were treated, I mean, you just cannot be treated any better than they treat people, the kindness. But I think this idea of black gods is very important because, and black religious movements, secular movements take on, and Raju, this is part of, I think, what you're getting at, and with secular movements are almost predisposed towards Western ideology, even when they don't want to be, or even when they think they're not. One of the things that comes across, and Michelle, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, it is without a question that Minister Ishmael, and by implication the Nation of Islam, wishes to transcend Western values because they see the West as at an endpoint.
Yeah.
Now, of course, religious movements always have that kind of teleology. We're near the end and so on. But I think theirs is more based upon modern history and the crisis of Western civilization. And that the new man and woman, and in his theology, there is clearly a concept, central concept of a new man and woman coming out of the end of the West, which they consider, they don't say the West as much as the rule of Satan, which has lasted for 6,000 years. By the way, another interesting thing, if their concept of infinity, that the human being is timeless. Now, that's a big question. I mean, we, in reading Kant, time, space, and Einstein, time, but they have a concept of timelessness, that you cannot put a beginning or end on the human being, which elevates the human being even beyond what is conceptualized in modern bourgeois philosophy, which claims to elevate man above God, above the church, and so on. They also have this idea that God is human. Now, how that works out is, and that Satan is human, which then elevates the centrality of human beings in making and remaking the world. Well, we don't have to answer, but this is his philosophical, and I don't want to say theology because it seems more like philosophy. The other thing is, I'm almost certain that he could not have done the interview without the approval of Minister Farrakhan. So it was not just Ishmael, it was interviewing one of the top leaders of the Nation of Islam, if not the top leader after Minister Farrakhan. One of the things we asked him about is the transition, because Minister Farrakhan has become silent. He's not speaking publicly. What is the transition like? And I think he answered in a very interesting way. He says, well, I have more responsibility. I have a lot of duties that I didn't have before, but we have set up a Shura Council. And it's about 7 or 8 men and 3 women. And he is the central figure in it. So he says, I have a collective that I work with, that I'm responsible to, that I can consult. But he said, I'm not a person who is so much into public speaking, being the center of attention. He says, I prefer to do things like perform marriages or help people through a difficult time, things like that. And frankly, when you see him, it's very apparent that that's the kind of person he is. Um, it is also clear, and this comes across in both days, and the 2 days are different because we went back and didn't do a lot of talk, but we'll do this now and do that. But just thinking about it in that first experience, which itself was very exhausting, they were exhaustive days. And I can say that I saw Minister Ishmael. You know when a person just exhausts themselves, and I was sitting next to him, and he was so involved, I could almost feel the heat from his body. Um, but I wanted to say a second. I think the second day helped to clarify the first day. For example, the Nation of Islam fell. The son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Wallace Dean Muhammad, who himself was named after and for Master Farad Muhammad, whose name is Wallace D. Farad Muhammad. So the man that is named after the man who the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says was God in human form, came to him in the person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That he, Wallace, would destroy the Nation of Islam. Now, Ishmael says that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad predicted this, but he said the nation would fall and it would rise again. And it has. That and that this second resurrection, it's called. Whereupon, after talking about, I asked him, "Do you think it will be a third resurrection?" And he said, "No, because the resurrection, second resurrection, was to restore the Nation of Islam." I was thinking in larger global terms. On the second day, he came back and he was talking about a third resurrection. That indeed it was a possibility. And after maybe the fall of, as they say, Satan, a resurrection of man, almost but then he had mentioned at the end of the first day, but there would be war. And I said, "Oh, well, I hope not." And he said, "Dr. Montero, there's only a slight chance that we can avoid it." He said that, I guess this is what they call a war of Armageddon, that war would be necessary to finally defeat evil. He said it would not be a long war. Now, this is because he speaks prophetically through prophecy. So it's not like the way we talk, but it's not that we can't understand how he thinks and he can't understand the way we think. So prophecy is metaphor and other things, he says it's prophesized, it has to be. And he said it will be a short war. He said it could become nuclear. In fact, he said it will become a nuclear war. But then humanity will be freed of evil. Well, you can, when I think we print it out and so on, you can see how his logic is. I guess I I'll kind of end on this because this was a lot of his philosophy and ideology interacts with his personal biography. And he feels that his theology is in a certain way a confirmation of his life's journey. At the end of the first day, he said in passing, he said, I didn't know my father until I was 7 years old. Or I think he said, I didn't know who my father was until I was 7 years old. And on the second day, at the end, I said, well, Minister Ishmael, we began with your biography, and I think we can end with your biography. And I said, you mentioned, I know, and that's why I'm glad I was there, because I don't think, you all could have asked it, given your ages, you would be more, constrained. And, maybe you all didn't know a lot about the Nation of Islam the way I do. So I felt not constrained, but very comfortable in asking him this question, which was a very personal question, obviously, but a question that he did not hesitate to answer in the most expansive way.
Well, that last question turned it from a 2-hour interview into a 3-hour interview. That last question.
Yeah.
And he kept coming back to it.
That's
He
right.
didn't want it to end.
That's right.
He
Didn't
felt
want
like
to
he needed
stop there
to say
because he wanted.
more. Yeah.
And I said, you said at the end of yesterday, you did not know your father, who your father was, until you were 7 years old. Could you tell us more about that? And he said, it's true. And then, no tears, but the voice broke. Is that fair to say? It was a very emotional thing, as you can imagine. He said, I only knew my father for 3 years. He died when I was 10. He said, he said, but our dear mother introduced us to God and thus made it possible for us to understand our parentage, that is, as a son of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. I had heard his brother Rasul, who was a special person, he just died, speak about this. And I'm of the opinion that one of the reasons they moved and were taken to Mexico is to protect them from the other children, especially the brothers of Wallace Muhammad, who, now this is me, it's not him. And I think this is important to understand in the history of the Nation of Islam. Wallace Muhammad and them didn't liquidate the Nation of Islam and its businesses and its property and all of that because the Honorable Elijah was teaching a hypocrisy, a heresy of Islam. That's not why they did it, because they wanted, it was a money grab to liquidate all the property and take the money. And therefore, they had to establish that Rasul and his brothers and sisters and other children of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad were, as Minister Ishmael said in the interview, bastards and illegitimate. And harm could come to them because of this. being around at that time, there was something very violent about the destruction of the first resurrection. When I say violent, psychologically, spiritually attacking people's beliefs, with people who had got off of heroin and other drugs because of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who had gotten off of alcohol, all kinds of things, return to those things in their lives because they cease to have a purpose. And that's why Minister Farrakhan occupies this elevated place in their history and in their present. But he talked about that difficulty, and it was something he was still reckoning with after all of these years. And he said his mother introduced them to God and thus created a way for them to understand who they were, the situation they were in. And then he said, but it is not Wallace Muhammad and Herbert and his blood brothers, but it is Rasul and it is Ishmael that are carrying on the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, which is, in a sense, is a confirmation that this, in their sense, that this had a purpose. Our suffering as children was purposeful, and the purpose is to prepare us to do what we're doing now. And he doesn't say any of this in a boastful way. And so you'll see it. I don't want to talk a lot about it. We met two of his daughters. One, the first day, she was so kind. And I said to her, "Oh, you look like your grandmother. That's Mother Tynetta." She says, I get that all the time. And she had recently gotten married. And then his younger daughter, who was 13, we met her. She goes to the Nation of Islam school. And maybe just one other thing I would say. I think, as we go forward, to understand Black folk and their democratic potential, this idea of Black gods, and how do Black gods, and we saw when we went to the United House of Prayer, how do the Black gods live when the white gods are dying?
Right.
And, I just was struck by the thing of, this Afrocentric thing. Oh, you praying to a white God. You need to go back to your African gods. Well, how do you know they ain't going back to them? What are these Black gods? And you see it both, and the Nation of Islam is very close to Black Christianity. In fact, Minister Ishmael cites the Christian Bible, at least the New Testament, but also the Old Testament, more than the Holy Quran, And even though on his the table beside his desk, he has the Holy Quran, not the Bible, but he cites the Bible, and he includes this line of prophets from Moses going forward to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and maybe Farrakhan. I have to say, a very elevated position for the human being. That the human being can do almost magical things. that it is in the hand, prophecy and the human being. And that he said that the Nation of Islam exists to educate people, to raise their consciousness, to prepare them for the struggles ahead. So at the end, we were so compatible in our feelings, our moralities, our purposes. And you know how Meghna is, how is Meghna? She's feeling everything, but a lot of times she doesn't express it. She's just acting, driving along and going, but all of this is in her, and she's feeling all of this. And so when she drops me off at the airport, me and Michelle off at the airport, she says, "Doc, it was surreal." She said it was life transforming. And I think that we in the Free School have made the right choice, who to align with. You can't be with everybody, and you can't stand with every idea just because it's popular. And they don't, and we don't. And I think morally, we are closer to them than we will ever be to the white left. I can say I felt, and I think, when Meghna, John, and Nay and them come here, and I think Michelle would agree, you just felt that these were people you could trust. They were people who trusted us. So I'll stop there. Say something.
Well, I was only present for the second day of the interview, but I think I benefited a lot from the research and the effort and the energy that everyone who had been preparing the interview had put into it. And I think what struck me most is that, well, you didn't say this today, but something that Doc had kept saying in Chicago was, this wasn't meant to happen. They didn't want us to have this. There were many forces that would have prevented.
You mean the rise of the nation?
No, the union of the NOI and Free School, or the meeting, or that's my interpretation of what you have been saying. And I think that it's, for some reason, it's also a little emotional for me, but like, he had been looking for that opportunity to work.
Oh, can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Forgive me, just one thing.
No, go ahead.
Just because
Yeah.
he doesn't do a lot of interviews. And he said to us, remember this?
Yeah.
That I usually I prepare for interviews.
Yeah.
He said, but somehow I didn't prepare I couldn't, like the days, you got something, but you don't, you have something to do, but it's not at the front of your thinking. Well, I'll do it when I get to it. Normally, he said when he does interviews, he's more prepared. He said he was less prepared for this one, but this was the best one he ever did. Remember?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Well, I just want to emphasize what you said in terms of the seriousness and the depth with which he treated that interview and the scale to which Free School was the perfect like mirror or perfect repository for that worldview, the worldview of the NOI, and then the vision, the leadership of the NOI, and that personal aspect. Because something that Doc had also said over the weekend is people like Minister Ishmael have had these stories that they've been wanting to tell for a long time, but haven't had the right person to tell it to. But we had both the trust and the knowledge for that relationship to be made. Honestly, like, I think I'm still processing a lot of it. But it was the it was the ideological union that I think really stuck out, and the compatibility of the worldviews. And I think the more that the members of the preschool gave, the more that he gave. And I think that's a lot of what I saw in the second year.
I know, if I could just say a few more things, contextualization. You know, I have a friend, you know, people who do the least have the most to say in a trivializing way about people who do the most. I don't know that that made sense. I have a friend who does nothing in terms of struggle. Great ideas, great mind, but he does nothing. And he refers to Minister Farrakhan as Louis. It's very insulting to me. Why? Louis? It's a way to say, to trivialize him, to say basically, because still we're dealing with this notion that the Nation of Islam, in particular, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Farrakhan, killed Malcolm. So that's one thing. So he's Louis. He's misleading Black people. You know, so it's this what. So that's one thing. Person who does a lot, the Million Man March, and many other things, and a person who does nothing. The person who does nothing can't explain the person that does a lot, so he has to trivialize it. The other thing is, you know, I grew up with the Wallace Muhammad's movement, the World Community of Islam, and I'm, you know, and my children, two of my children are Muslim, Sunni. So, and then being, if you're in the Black community in Philadelphia, you're around a lot of real and fake Muslims, a lot of Black people like Islam, they like the, that it is, I don't know, but you know, rappers like Islam and all that. But everybody's a Sunni. And in Philadelphia, about 40% of Black people identify as Muslim, maybe the largest percentage of any city of Black people. But Sunni Islam, and I think they've now retreated on this, have always talked about the Nation of Islam as an apostasy, a fake Islam. And a lot of that came from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And when you look at the practice of Islam in those countries, who could be more fake? You know, the Saudi ruling family? Oh, you're the real Muslims? The Egyptian? Okay. So, you know, I mean, who are they? But it is, and this is what Johan was the first to say this to me a few years ago at a conference we had. He was on the panel, and he said that the Nation of Islam is an important reform movement within Islam. And I know for people, you know, like Samir and Jahan, who are brought up as Muslim, Islam means nothing to them if it's not the Nation of Islam, or at least it makes more sense. And it is connected to something of significance, the Black community and the Black struggle. So that's another thing. And I knew when Minister Ishmael, I didn't say this, and he was, you know, you could see the pain of him even saying this. You know, I grew up being called a bastard and illegitimate. That's what he said. And that was in a lot of ways coming from Wallace Muhammad. And then of course, the role of cultural nationalism and so on. which says the Nation of Islam killed Malcolm. And that's in, Ibram Kendi's recent book. How does he know? And who was he? And the other thing is, this is, I just, for our sakes, the whole question of Malcolm X. Ozzie Davis, great actor, leftist, peace fight, just everything, referred to Malcolm as our shining prince. Okay? And in a certain way, he was, but not always. Malcolm X obviously had a mental breakdown. And when he gathered himself, attempted to gather himself, he wanted to rejoin the Nation of Islam. And the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, in spite of everything, said, well, yes, you can, but you should never be the minister of Mosque number 7 in Harlem. And I think he understood a lot of the bad influences upon Malcolm came from the Harlem nationalists, the Garveyists, and that type of thing. Even Malcolm's rhetoric towards the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King were heavily influenced by them, more than, let us say, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So, in spite of, and this is very extraordinary, in spite of all of the headwinds against the Nation of Islam, and Louis Farrakhan in particular, they resurrected it.
Yeah.
And now, if you want to talk about Black liberation theology, I don't know that you have anywhere, there's only one place that you can really talk about it in any concrete way, and that's the Nation of Islam. Most churches have abandoned not theology, but liberation theology. And very few have a theology that acknowledge what we see all around us, the centrality of Black folk and the special character. I think about this a lot. If you try to put us in Africa, we don't quite fit. If you try to keep us in America, we don't quite fit, But if you see us as part of a larger historical process, like none of the transformation of modernity to colored modernity. So if you look at Black folk, we fit very good into Bandung. We fit very good in here. You know what I'm saying? If you say, we're African. Well, we are, but we're Asiatic. And that's another thing with the nation of the Asiatic Black man. They have some other, because they see this timelessness that you cannot talk about what the Asiatic Black man or Black people as beginning at a certain time. They transcend time. But, and this is the key, the white man begins in time and will end. I don't want to get in. Alice is not here, so I'm not going to repeat her favorite. But yeah, it is very interesting. And that Asia is the center of this new thing. Now, and he said that modern human beings, I think he said humanity, begins in India. And then Meghna man crawled out of the womb of India. And it's just so extraordinary to see that common thing in Du Bois. And now, here's a weakness. They put too much respect on Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey, and they don't know Du Bois. I'm really trying to finish this essay because I want to send it to Minister Ishmael. They don't know Du Bois. But yeah, that's all I to say those few things.
I want to say many things, so I'm hesitating because I've listened to some of the interview and a lot of my thoughts are very speculative. So, but I think I want to start from one question that really stood out to me that was asked to Minister Ishmael, which was something we've discussed in preschool, this idea that the Nation of Islam is the only organization of Black folk that survived the counter-revolution after the end of the, and I found Minister Ishmael's answer to that question of how that was possible very interesting. And the way he put it was basically it was because they had the righteous God by the side, or Minister Louis Farrakhan had the blessing or the divine mandate of the righteous God. But I mean, from the whole conversation, the way I thought about it was also, I think what makes more sense to me, given like the way we have formulated certain ideas about what the counter-revolution was, even after the end of the Black freedom struggle, I see really the greatest strength of the nation that basically allows them to survive the onslaught of ruling class ideology is really the operation on a civilization principle that is a negation of white civilizational principles. Like, like everything that theology is, like one of the central cores of that is basically to show the moral bankruptcy of white ideology or white standards and what we would call the white supremacist social system, and to tell Black people, but all people really, to turn away from these standards and turn towards the real gods of, and also what you pointed out, Doc, this idea of Black gods. And really, I was thinking about it when we went to the United House of Prayer, the fact that, I mean, who is the God? Is it Daddy Grace? And, Daddy, I mean, all these figures, and what you pointed out is that the Black God is always human and then is a man. And then what the nation says, the complementary idea of that is the Black man is God. And really, all of that made me.
Or another way to put it, God is Black man. I mean, it's a little thing, but I think, go ahead, you go ahead. So.
I mean, I don't have the words to say it either. So, but I feel like that's sort of what becomes then the central principle, or even the central organizing principle of the nation, as I see it, is to provide an alternative civilizational basis, an alternative ideological basis. Because, and the other interesting thing that Minister Ishmael also said, that when a great civilization falls, it's always from within, from a crisis from within. When a civilization that has become so powerful that it's the dominant force behind human action and thought everywhere, external powers rarely stand a chance to bring it down. It happens through a rotting and a collapse from within. And I feel like the nation's role in establishing a new theology, a liberation theology, and these Black gods basically been in preparation for that inevitable civilizational collapse of the white world. And the other thing that really struck me from the interview was also how much the conversation was about knowledge and science. Religion, basically, he said this thing, which is religion and faith have to be rooted in science because they have to explain, they have to explain to man's relationship to material reality. And, he basically picked up certain things from like white Christian theology to point out that who would believe this? For instance, Immaculate Conception, or the Virgin. birth and so on. And he was basically like, okay, how can you believe that this, how can man believe that this actually makes sense? And that also made me think a lot about how the nation gets a lot of criticism because their theology is like so outlandish, and they talk about aliens and UFOs. But then I was also thinking that why is it any more outlandish than a lot of what, just traditional white Christianity, the mythology that they hold? Why does that have this unassailable authority and cannot be questioned? And what the nation is saying is just like completely out the door. It's bizarre and crazy. The other thing in the context of knowledge, he also said this thing where he said that revolution is basically the turning of the human mind, or an ideological turn of the human mind.
Yes.
And resurrection, they see resurrection as the creation of a new human being. And he says that all of this takes knowledge. And so religion basically is also a way to bring knowledge of truth and of the righteous God to people. I thought that that was very relevant to what we are talking about in terms of new epistemologies and new science for the knowledge conference.
Yeah, no, I just want to say, I feel like this. Yeah, no, this is very interesting to me because I just got back from a trip to Europe with my mom, and we went to Vienna in Austria and then Prague in the Czech Republic. But it was really interesting being especially in Vienna because Vienna used to be the seat of Habsburg Empire, which kind of was in some ways the political arm that ruled on behalf of the Catholic Church during the kind of medieval ages and all that. And like I know we talk about Western civilization, we talk about even the Holy Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, and the kind of contemporary analogs today. But it was really like visceral to see it up close, like what this really meant, like this whole architecture that was built, like all of the cathedrals that were built, the art, especially the art of the Counter-Reformation, which is kind of the Catholic Church's reaction against the Protestant movement. And really what we mean when we say the Catholic Church was like the state, but the decadence that went with that as well. And, like whether it was like Martin Luther, and I actually learned that there were kind of pre-Reformation movements in Europe that preceded Martin Luther, but yeah, like someone like Luther was seen as a heretic. He was a heretic. He was someone who was not just going against the authority of the church, but at the heart of it was both protests against the Catholic Church as kind of the arbiter, like the kind of authority behind the state, but also a basic understanding of like who God is. And the Protestant Reformation, and I think that the Catholic Church is also kind of, I don't know if you would agree with this, Albert, but like come closer also in terms of bringing God closer to humanity, which is, that in my view is kind of the contribution of the Protestant Reformation. And in a lot of ways, like I feel like when I first encountered the Nation of Islam and like sat through some of their meetings and services, like a lot of like my instinctive Christian upbringing is like, this doesn't make sense to me at all. Like it's very heretical. Like it's very like going, because like even when we would sit through mosque in Philly with like Minister Rodney, for example, he'd be like, like, so they say, the Christians say that the resurrection happened after 3 days, but then they have Good Friday and then Easter Sunday. That's 2 days. And I'd be like, you're right. I hadn't thought about that before. And it's like small things like that, but like you're saying, it's like they're also, like I said it before, I've never had to think so much during a quote unquote religious service than during a meeting of the Nation of Islam in their mosques. And they're really challenging me all the time to think. And it is, it is a movement of thought in that way. But I think, especially in this time, whether it's the Nation of Islam or other manifestations, this is a time that calls for what would be otherwise seen as heresy. It calls for movements of people that, have to actually go against the orthodoxy of whether it's the kind of established religion but kind of the other broader civilizational assumptions that are held so closely. And I don't know, I've just been thinking about that and how basically, yeah, like what I would see is like most of the entirety of, yeah, like most established religions have lost the edge that at one time may have made them revolutionary to begin with. And that you have to, yeah, kind of go against the orthodoxies of all this. And the only other thought I had was, in a lot of ways, I feel like Du Bois was working out a lot of these questions as well, because it's like, whether it's in like Black Reconstruction, where he says like, and I feel like I don't think I fully appreciated the way that Du Bois said this, but he's like, for the Black worker, God was real. Like, I don't know, just the way that he says that, and like, I think it's coming up in the word chapter, but I feel like I've always kind of interpreted a certain way, but I feel like even the way that you're talking about the interview, it's forcing me to rethink what Du Bois is saying in that part of Black Reconstruction, that, yeah, for Black people, God is real. And also, I think it's either in Darkwater or somewhere else where he has that kind of short story, Jesus Christ in Texas.
Yeah.
And he talks about, yeah, like Christ as a Black man in Texas in Jim Crow South. And yeah, and I feel like actually in a lot of ways, like Du Bois is a thinker who
He would have been discriminated against.
right, yeah. Who best explains and helps to clarify even, yeah, the significance of a movement like the nature of Islam. And so, yeah, I'm very excited for the interview. I'm very excited that we can bring this to people. And just what you were saying, like Minister Ishmael himself saying, I've never done an interview like this. The fact that he was not just willing to spend so much time with you, but to be so open and generous and vulnerable. Yeah, I'm very happy, and I really am grateful to all of you who were part of the interview. So yeah.
I wanted to respond. I like what Jeremiah said about now's the time for heresy, because it reminded me of what was his name? Mahdi said in the Zion down the road when he said we need a new Bible. And sort of, I consider the Nation of Islam to be under the full, quote, Orthodox Islam. And I'm not proud just of the Nation of Islam, but also of all the other, Islamic civilizations, like, the Moors, Andalusia, Persia, Turkey, even, European Muslims I feel sort of kinship with, like Khabib. But it's because, this is to answer your question about why are North Philly African American men so attracted to Islam. Unlike Christianity, Islam promotes, sort of an eye for an eye. It's not a turn the other cheek sort of religion. And the whole idea of men coming together to pray on Friday comes from sort of a military. The prophet would pray, and then all his lieutenants would be behind him in the front. And that's sort of a way for all the villages to see, okay, who are all the military men or who are the men of military age that the village can muster every week. But African American, or let's just say Muslims in North Philly, can sometimes they use the language of Islam to express a civilizational origin, and many people have done this. But what's unique about the Nation of Islam is unlike saying, oh well, my real theological origin comes from Jordan or Saudi Arabia. It comes uniquely from North America, as they describe themselves, Black Muslims of North America. And it's interesting, the main point I wanted to get to was the ability for the African American people to produce new religion. Sort of the side effects of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment has been, as Nietzsche said, God is dead, man killed him, and now man is God. I sort of see.
So interesting.
I sort of see what the free school does. Because if we're in the business of comparing the free school to every organization we come across, I sort of see the free school as the mini religion, as the human religion. You know, the future of if we can't have ancient religion, then we have to have the product of the Enlightenment. We need to go back to religion because religion is part of civilization. That's what the Nation of Islam has managed to do: is bring modern, living religion, materialist religion, religion tied to the oppressed people, religion tied to material conditions. And that's really the contribution that's going on there, more so than looking back to the moon.
Magna and Jahan have some comments.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah.
Magna says, it was a life-changing experience.
Say that again.
It was a life-changing experience. Minister Ishmael broke the boundaries between science and theology and philosophy. We find the love and graciousness that's missing at Gnosticism. It was also significant that he said it is the time to create something new rather than entangling in the old and dying. It's a profound nation for the darker nation. And that's also what we're doing in preschool. And then also how the Nation of Islam theology is profoundly democratic. The implications of the Black man being God. That idea and that concept is at the heart of colored modernity. She said, the interview also made me reflect on our epistemology, which believes in the people as the agent of knowledge and brings us to the people. And then she also said, Minister Ishmael asked us to invite him for an Indo-Pakistani meal. I need the chefs in preschool to come to And then Jahan also had a comment. I would add that it was a profound dialogue pointing us to the need to work towards the new epistemology.
Say that again. It's profound dialogue.
That points us to the need to work towards a new epistemology for the people, including to redefine concepts like man, reason, faith, and even God. And I feel like that kind of, I guess, connects to like this concept of like a third resurrection, or even like a renaissance, to just like redefine, I guess, the pivotal like concepts that would make, I guess, a new civilization or make civilization possible again. I think that's, those are the comments.
Well, I want to add one thing. I think this idea that man, God and man are related, and that man can be a co-creator with God. Man can make his own destiny. I think it's a very deep idea. Actually, I also see it a lot in the Boyce, and if it's okay, I just want to read 4 lines from this poem that the Boyce has called A Hymn to the Peoples. And he ends like this. He says, save us, world spirit, from our lesser selves. Grant us that war and hatred cease. Reveal our souls in every race and hue. Help us, O human God, in this thy truce to make humanity divine. And I was just thinking about that all the time you were speaking.
That's what it says. I have to send that to Minister Ishmael.
Can I add one more thing? Is like as we started to talk more and more about this thing of Black gods, and then even just this thing about like, okay, man as a co-creator with God, it helped me understand something that we had been looking at with Charles Mingus better. Because I think a lot of us had remarked that like his autobiography is written from the perspective of God. Like he begins by talking about Mingus's youth and birth as a young Black man in a white society from the perspective of God. And in it, at the start and the beginning, he begins by saying, I'm 3. So like he says that like there's the true Mingus, like the soul of who I am, and then there's the personality that the society forces me to be, like the reactive Mingus. And then the third is essentially God, like the personality that watches the two. But then like a character in the book asks him, like, well, which one is the real you? And he's like, all of them are the real me. But there's just a lot I'm still trying to understand there, but I think I'm just excited to go more in this direction because like I haven't had as much of a religious background as like maybe some other people. But back to something you were saying as well is maybe this is something we can pull out in the interview, but why the theology of the NOI is closer to a modern Islamic religion than like what is practiced elsewhere. Because my understanding is that in a city like Philadelphia, like there is hostility directed toward the NOI as not being the true Islam. Like maybe a lot more people know more about that, but I'm wondering if that's something that maybe we dealt with more on the first day as well. But yeah, just the way that they've advanced Islam so far, or everything they've advanced, because the thing that also struck out to us is if the epistemology and the organization of the NOI produced a Minister Ishmael, what does that mean? Because I think we were just so blown away by the scale and the scope and the depth and the detail of his thinking.
Yeah.
The ancient and the it was everything, right? The philosophic and the poetic, like the personal and the social.
It's also almost like what you're saying. What is Islam? In some ways, Minister Ishmael in the NOI redefines what we consider religion.
Yeah.
Because, like, there's something he said in the day one of the interview, which is the only day I watched because it's 3 hours each, and where he says, I forget what exactly, paraphrasing, he's basically like, well, what is religion? I would argue that, like, there's a lot of things that say they're religion that aren't religious because religion is meant to make man complete. Like, religion seeks to make man more complete. Basically, like, to me, it really reminded me of the way we in free school talk about this era of human history as modernity, which has not been completed yet, where, like, even the goals of the Enlightenment, this idea of what does it mean to make man, like, I forget the word you used earlier, Doc, but basically, what does it mean to make man, like, more central, or that man has agency?
Yeah.
But then Du Bois goes further and says that man is, what does it mean to make man divine? To bring man so close to the absolute of truth or beauty or God, our concept of God. That I felt like Minister Ishmael was also basically saying, like, because in a lot of ways, I feel like the Nation of Islam, yes, it is a religion, but then also in some ways, it's like, it's not even like religious in that sense, but and it may not even be Islamic, but in a lot of ways is both, like what you're saying, Michelle, a modern religion, like a new religion, and it is a, like, in a lot of ways, it's a worldview. It's a philosophy that describes human freedom, the striving and search for human freedom. Because when I was looking at all the Bandung speeches, like it's kind of interesting because all the Islamic countries, the Muslim countries at Bandung, the way they applied verses from the Quran and gave it meaning is much more similar to the Nation of Islam. And it's not because it's not about Islam. It's about what you do with the philosophy about man, and what gives it meaning in a struggle in modern human history, where in a lot of ways the anti-colonial movement or the struggle for freedom in America, these great world historic struggles for freedom, are basically what the Bible talks about. It is essentially, like, in the concrete, what the Bible or Quran talks about or prophesizes. To make man divine, to make human life beloved, like, so it's kind of, so in a lot of ways, like, because it is a good question of, like, what makes the Nation of Islam and free school so in sync in some ways, and it's not just, I don't want to reduce this part because it actually has a lot of deep meaning of, like, I think, one, it is deep that the Nation of Islam produces some of the most beautiful human beings, like, because in a lot of ways, the most concrete question of what a new civilization or new society, what we think it should look like, is the question of what kind of children would a new society produce and a new civilization produce? Like, what quality of human beings would be produced? And that's as much of a moral question as it is a, like, material question of, like, no poverty, like, what kind of economy, what kind of, like, values. But the second thing was, I think what makes the Nation of Islam and free school so connected is, I think maybe you're saying this, Jeremiah, at the end, which is whether they talk about Du Bois or not, I think there is a common worldview of what time on the clock is it, and what is the pathway out. It is something that is not white. In fact, like, a new set of values that, like Du Bois says, believes that the truth or God or mankind is beautiful, must be beautiful. Like, it is a positive vision. It is the belief that what we have today is like hellish, satanic, like a failure, like white modernity has been a failure. And that's something that's, I think, that's also what's really deep about the concept of black gods. Because black gods is not just it's not just a religious phrase. It's also a statement about a new future, like a new human future, like a new human being. And because even at the United House of Prayer for All People, you got the sense that the way they're playing the trombone, it wasn't even like an orchestra. It wasn't even like Duke Ellington. It was very much like a boundless, like emotion filled, like, let me stretch this trombone as far and wide as I can to basically express that the Lord has already come. Like, it's almost like you felt like they were announcing, like, I'm an alien. Like, I don't even belong to this planet. I don't even follow the rules of gravity. I already like have conjured God. And like, I'm already beyond the confines of the human imagination of what has produced today, and I'm ushering in a new era. And so I think there's something about that worldview, and there's actually something about the fact that, I guess this is what Johan and Megna were saying, it's deep that in the Nation of Islam, religion is not a confined concept, but in fact, religion has a lot to do with life and struggle. Like, it has to do with, it's not, whereas like white religion, which is not just in America, but I think to a certain degree you could say it's around the world, like the hypocritical religions, what you said is the fake Muslims. The fake Muslims is that when religion becomes less about explaining life and the striving of human beings to like achieve God or make man divine, but instead becomes reduced to saying nothing about life. And yeah.
Yeah, one question I'm very interested in that I got from what you were saying, Doc, is I feel like for a while we had talked about the Nation of Islam as like Old Testament, if that makes sense. And I think, especially even with someone concretely like Minister Ishmael, but in general, seeing the Nation of Islam not just as like Old Testament Bible, but the New Testament,
Especially the Christ figure.
Yes, yeah. I think that it's changing my concept of the nation. For sure.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was actually thinking about how a couple of months ago we went to this black church in North Philly.
So,
Well,
no.
The Garden of
oh,
Mother Zor. Oh,
so we went to Mother Zor. We heard we stayed for a service, and I remember that service, and I also thought about how, went to a service in Zion, heard about it from Alice Nettie, and a lot of what that service was trying to say was, well, God is a figure who is looking out for you, and at the end of the day, all you need to do is trust Him, and He will make everything all right. Statistic, but it's kind of what I got from it. And then thinking about what Minister Ishmael was saying during his entire interview, he was like, "Okay, you have to believe in God. You have to trust Him. He is His word passed through the most honorable Minister Elijah Muhammad, and then Louis Farrakhan will reach everybody, and then they will know how to act and be better people." But then I feel like he also puts a lot of emphasis on how man has to also change. Like I felt that the last part of the conversation on day 2 was centered a lot around the human being and what is the path that they need to change. Like, God is there, He's guiding you, and you must trust His word. But you also have to put a certain amount of effort into changing yourself. There has to be a sort of revolution within you if you need to do something about everything else. I think that is something that he was thinking, he was talking about. And there is that. What I'm trying to say is that I felt that there was a distinct difference between what I heard in the black churches of Delhi and what
Definitely.
Minister Ishmael was trying to say, where there was almost a predeterministic element in the Christian sermons, whereas I remember Minister Ishmael saying that I don't want to think about tomorrow. I want to know what I'm going to do today, and based on that, I'm going to think about tomorrow. I mean, of course, this is out of context, and it doesn't exactly.
Yeah, one is passivity,
Mhm.
and that's the impact of the counter-revolution of these decades upon the Black church. It has often retreated into passivity. And, it was interesting when we did the documentary out in Chicago, and I think one of the women and Minister Ishmael talked about weight. Remember that? And I said, wait, we need to take it. And then in his sermon the next day, I'm sorry, I just want to say it is a theology of passivity.
And I think that what the Nation of Islam, and in Minister Ishmael's words, he's asking the people to also take responsibility for themselves.
No question.
And I think that is, I'm still trying to sort of trying to figure out what religion means to people here, and the path to somewhere through religion. I'm thinking about the whole secularism versus religious movement thing.
See, I think just in this dialectical sense, what he's talking about and what he calls religion is the path through which man realizes himself and his potential, his moral self and his moral potential. That's and it's active. It's an activist of the. Maybe we should go to the knowledge conference. I'm sorry.
No, yeah, I just one of the final things you said made me think a lot that the theology of the Nation of Islam is both a philosophy and a science, evidenced by the kind of human beings that they're able to produce. I have a lot of respect for my man's Hegel and Kant, because they're able to, sit there and think, and from those ideas, they were able to explain the world, even though it's very abstract. But the way that the Nation of Islam has developed their philosophy and their theology by going to the prisons, going to these back alleys, going to shootings, really, and being able to see the world in such a way and act in the world in such a way that you can take people that are produced by the worst that this world is able to do and elevate them to that of someone who is a creator of the future. This is a living, breathing theology that has evolved, that has allowed it to exist even through the counter-revolution and in these times when society is continuing to collapse. And that it is both, I think, philosophy and theology and science.
So interesting. So interesting. Let's work at it.
Well, maybe we can read the vision statement from the Knowledge Symposium and then provide an update.
Just read it, right? Okay, so the symposium, the research symposium is titled W.E.B. Du Bois and the New World Movement of Thought Towards a Shared Revolutionary Future. W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, enters the stage of world history at a new epoch of modernity, marked by the emancipation of 4 million black workers from chattel slavery. He declares that the problem of the 20th century, that is the problem of modernity, is the problem of the color line. He thus identifies white supremacy as the principal obstacle in the way of the peoples of the world coming together in community and communion and working shoulder to shoulder as brothers and sisters to build a future deserving of the modern man. He expands the conception of modernity to include all of humanity, and particularly those millions of enslaved and colonized dark peoples of the world, now conscious and restless to leave their mark on human thought and action in the modern world. He thus begins a new world movement of thought, which bends knowledge, science, and morality towards achieving the total freedom of all. These dying days of Western civilization, when chaos presses in all around us, we turn to Du Bois for light. Du Bois starts from the belief that knowledge is indispensable to the project of human freedom, and that the human being, who is the creator and agent of knowledge, must be studied and known in all his complexity. This requires not just science and reason, but also art, a creative and futuristic imaginary in which the human soul can find expression. He combined history and philosophy to create the modern science of sociology and deployed it to scientifically study Black America, the life world and aspirations of those within the veil, of whom he was bone of bone and flesh of the flesh. In the soul strivings of Black folk, despised and rejected by their own countrymen, he saw a civilization in potentiality, the capacity for great beauty, art, and music that gives nobility and meaning to human life. He dared to go against the accepted wisdom of his time, boldly asserting that the historically constituted consciousness of Black folk, the Black proletarian imaginary, had a contribution to make to human knowledge. Du Bois, in rooting himself in the Black poor, made an epistemic break from Western modes of knowing and thinking about the world, a transgression that rendered him persona non grata in the white world for most of the 20th century. He was attacked and trivialized, his life's work suppressed and denied its rightful inheritance by new generations in new times. A Europe exhausted and devastated by the world wars ceded the mantle of Western civilization to the American empire, which further entrenched the color line and arrested the advance of knowledge and modernity by claiming both as the exclusive domain of white people. The multifaceted crisis facing Western societies today must be seen as a crisis of Western civilization itself. The unchallenged hegemony of the US led world order is coming to an end, its legitimacy rejected by the world's people in view of its utter failure to take humanity forward. In America, the deepening poverty, homelessness, and deaths of despair, the breakdown of communities and civil society, and the profound crisis of meaning and purpose in human lives serves as a memento mori, signaling the death of white civilization and the standards it seeks to impose upon the world. The mood of the nation is dark, confusion reigns in the thoughts of people. Wars and rumors of wars are mirrored by inner shadows of hysteria, cynicism, and mental illness. Many of the basic assumptions we are taught to hold about the world, which give our lives coherence, are breaking apart. These are the signs made jarringly real of our crisis of civilization. Nowhere is this crisis more apparent today than in the American university, a vital pillar of American power and the de facto standard bearer of white civilization. The period of the Cold War saw the consolidation of the elite university as an indispensable instrument of the American state and its ruling elite. It exists to further the political, ideological, and military agenda of the American empire. For 80 years, the university has operated as the ultimate custodian and arbiter of all knowledge, mirroring the medieval church in the completeness of its authority. The university is where elite consensus is manufactured and white supremacist values codified in all streams of human thought. Its reach extends across all disciplines of the natural and social sciences. It claims the final authority on all questions of human importance, from the meaning of progress, freedom, and democracy to a criteria for art, culture, and civilization to justification for America's forever wars and genocide. This consensus goes beyond America and is championed by the westernized intelligentsia everywhere, ensuring that the world is made and remade in the image of the white man. Last year, at our conference titled The Crisis of Knowledge and the American University, we claimed that this ideological consensus, which derives its authority not from the people or from history, but from a small minority of elites and experts, was too fragile to hold. This claim is favored by the events that have transpired between then and now, not least of which is the election of Donald Trump as president last November. The American people, in enormous numbers, were not swayed by the fierce political and legal campaign mounted against him. This was a broad rejection of the dominant liberal consensus and worldview of the ruling elite, a rejection whose implications go far beyond the actions of Trump himself. American society has now become a battleground of sharply disparate ideological narratives, signifying the breakdown of a unified political order. The anti-elite sentiment of the American people is seen manifest in an unprecedented lack of trust in institutions of higher education. The people have no use for the authority of experts who claim to speak for them but have nothing but contempt for them. This must be remembered when we assess the battle of elite universities like Harvard against the assault of the Trump administration. It must be said, Harvard is not engaged in a battle to defend democracy or freedom of speech, ideals which are incompatible with its reason for existing. Rather, Harvard and its like stand as principal bastions of Western civilization, and on trial is the West's authority as the last word on human thought and knowledge. The university has failed the people's aspiration for democracy and peace. It has actively blocked the advance of knowledge in its efforts to keep humanity stranded in the epoch of Europe. Its best and most lauded theories, from string theory in physics to postmodernism in the humanities, claim to be theories of everything, but explain nothing of the real world. It has nothing to offer to a young person who seeks to know the world and to take responsibility for it. The only future that he or she can be promised is to become part of the ruling elite who represent a dying civilizational ideal. The university is responsible for the cultural, moral, and cognitive manipulation of generations of young people, which is perhaps the most unforgivable of its crimes. This should make us ask, is there any redemption for the American university? Why should it be defended? And since it is now clear that the university cannot take us forward, where should we turn for knowledge and science that can explain the world and its people unmediated by the West? In a time when humanity is more conscious of itself than ever before, it is the struggle of ideas which alone can take human knowledge and civilization forward. This research symposium is our optimistic contribution to that ideological struggle. We see ourselves as inheritors of Du Bois's world movement of thought and call on all American revolutionaries to join us in giving it new life in our times. Witnessing the collapse of Europe after World War II and the Great Depression, Du Bois sought an explanation in the history and philosophical assumptions of modern European civilization. Today, when the last flag bearer of Western civilization, which is the American state, is in collapse, we must choose to walk in Du Bois's footsteps or condemn ourselves to the wrecking heap of history. The historic achievements of the European Enlightenment and modernity must be studied for their role in taking humanity to a higher stage of consciousness. The ideological struggle to free the human agent of knowledge from the authority of the church, best exemplified in the revolutionary philosophy of Immanuel Kant, cannot be trivialized. We cannot forget the revolutionary contributions of Hegel, Marx, and Lenin in furthering the cause of human thought and freedom. We must remember that the modern world was built on the wings of great movements of thought, of science and philosophy that held at their core the belief that the human being can know, and in doing so, become free to shape the future. Du Bois did not reject modernity. Rather, he exposed how the need to justify slavery and colonialism corrupted Western knowledge and science. He reminded us that the modern industrial world was built on the back of the black worker, not a slave of antiquity, but an enslaved proletariat who possessed agency. He was no less human or capable of knowing the world than the white worker. Du Bois rejected the thesis that the dark races were inherently inferior, citing the civilizational achievements of Asia, Africa, and Black America that far surpassed their European counterparts. He saw the world in its movement and possibilities, laying the foundation for a new social science which sought not just laws of human development, but probed the realm of chance, the capacities of human action to defy laws. Thus, he saw that the great moral and philosophical questions facing the modern world could only be answered by dark humanity, overcoming the assumptions of white supremacy. Rather than a clash of civilizations, he championed dialogue and ideological exchange among civilizations. He remained in close contact with the anti colonial struggles of Asia and Africa and the world communist and peace movements. Ignored and trivialized in the West, Du Bois was embraced by the world's people for his contributions to human knowledge and freedom and the struggle for colored modernity. The Du Boisian epistemology, rooted in the consciousness of the black proletariat, explains the Chinese Revolution, the Indian freedom struggle, and the national liberation struggles of Africa with a completeness that Marxism Leninism, arguably the most advanced of European revolutionary thought, cannot. It allows us to see the universal strivings that connect Afro Asia to Afro America in their shared struggle against a white supremacist world order, which is as much a struggle to create new human beings, new standards of life, and a new criteria for knowledge and civilization. It explains the great mobilization for peace in Asia and Africa, as well as in the Black freedom movement in America, as the concrete democratic demand of dark humanity at a new stage of consciousness and modernity, when peace had become inseparable from freedom and the prerequisite for the full flowering of human genius and potential everywhere. It casts light on the heaving thoughts and hearts of the discontented masses in America today. Du Bois was indicted as an agent of the Soviet Union and barred from traveling abroad for daring to take a stand for peace in the McCarthy era. This would make him say, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called communists." Today, without the Soviet Union, the white left has conveniently reclaimed the flag of communism while becoming essentially indistinguishable in their ideology from the American ruling elite. Therefore, it has become acceptable and, in fact, fashionable to invoke Du Bois in our times, but for an entirely counter revolutionary purpose. There is a redoubled effort by academics and leftists to reduce Du Bois to a harmless academic and use him to reinscribe the color line by pushing fraudulent narratives of Black history in the name of postmodernism and cultural nationalism. This attempt to strip his life's work of its revolutionary edge is in service of producing counter-revolutionaries who perform radicalism but are well adjusted to war, who do not know Du Bois or the people, and for whom peace is merely an abstract talking point. And yet, the student movements of last spring protesting the university's unabashed support for Israel in its genocide in Gaza prove the moral striving of today's youth. The courage and determination of these young students give us all renewed hope for the future of the American people and their capacity to bring this nation back from the brink of spiritual and civilizational death. The students' desire to know the Palestinian people speaks to a growing thirst among Americans to know humanity rather than wage war against it. The innate goodness of the young, their striving for true beauty and purpose, must be forged into revolutionary consciousness through a truly moral education. Ideas are the most powerful weapon for a revolutionary, and the struggle for knowledge and philosophy in our time is a revolutionary political task. We must carve out of the chaos of Western civilization a new revolutionary epistemology that reveals in all its glory the breaking light of a new dawn, the epoch of humanity. This great experiment will not be conducted by academics, experts in the elite university. It will involve the creative participation of the world's billions who are coming into their own and are ready to take up the revolutionary, democratic, and emancipatory struggle for a shared human future. We call upon all people of conscience, artists, students, youth, and children to join us in treading new regions of thought, to seek, as Du Bois did, a new heaven and a new earth. Let us come awake to the spirit of our age.
Just two things, rather than cultural nationalism, say Afrocentricity, and include you say postmodernism. You said also include transgender theory, queer theory, theories of every form.
The poetic parts are due to get.
I know.
It's much work. Throw this in the trash.
Yeah, do it.
I think like the more we protest, the more you want to do it.
I said I wasted my time. They got
Yeah, so the research symposium will be 3 days, but the first date is June 24th, which is a Tuesday, and that's where Doc will have his talk and essay. But the title of the research symposium is W.E.B. Du Bois and the New World Movement of Thought Towards a Shared Revolutionary Future. And so this is both, I guess, a 1-year follow-up of the first knowledge conference, which was on the American University and sort of bearing out everything that has taken place in the last year. But I think it's also putting together and developing a lot of the ideas that we've been working on for like the last year, which includes like the white supremacist social system, the American state, especially Du Bois and the New World Movement of Thought. And I think especially the new epistemologies for a new epoch. And so I will talk a little bit about the program.
Don't give it up like a dying gangster now.
Okay, so the first day is Tuesday, the 24th, and that'll be from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. at the Lucian Blackwell Library. And so this is the same time as the regular reading group, but it's a public lecture by Dot. And so that's the essay that the Black Swan.
With drawing from the essay.
Yeah, something like that, man.
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
So yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois, architect of a new world movement of thought. And so this is sort of like establishing partially the framework of why, like what we mean when we say Du Bois as the father or the originator of a new world movement of thought. And so that will be the public lecture and then a community discussion. And so that'll be on the floor of the library. And then we're here in poster. Okay, and then the main, I guess, like the main 2 days of the research symposium will be that long weekend. So Tuesday and then Saturday, Sunday, June 28th and 29th. And so the first day will be from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. So a full day. It will be 2 roundtables and a panel. The first roundtable is on the collapse of the ideological consensus. And so this is basically a roundtable laying the framework of why we're doing this conference in the first place, the stakes of what we're talking about, why knowledge is important. Giving the opportunity to expand on the vision statement, like especially the rationale. And what we mean when we say that, like, there is a collapse of civilization and where the ideological consensus is now. Because last year, I think we had made a thesis point or claim that it was going to collapse, and that you could see that fracturing in the student movement and also in like the broad mobilization against the genocide. And so now we're at a point where that loss of consensus, like that consensus is broken, but there's also in some ways like a chaos where it's not clear what the new ideological consensus will hinge around and how it will be consolidated. But I think our point is that it's Du Bois who most clearly like sees both what the new consensus or the new like ideological ground can be, and that in some ways this is the time to bring to completeness some of the ideas that were opened up in the 20th century as well. And yeah, and so I think especially talking about how the institutions of government have lost the people, the role of the university in that, how we actually understand the attack on the university. And so I think continuing some of these threads of, I guess, the contradiction of Trump, like on the one hand, his attack on the university and what actually that signifies. And then also I think what this crisis looks like from, I guess, inside society, American society, and then also from around. Then, so that's the first roundtable. Then we're going to have a panel entitled Kant, Einstein, Lenin, a Du Boisian investigation.
I'm sorry. I mean, I'm not. Just go ahead. Mercy.
Yeah, we're going straight into it. And so this is sort of tracing, I guess, the ideological history of like the modern world through three representative figures, Kant, Einstein, and Lenin. And so we're interested in basically getting to the present moment, but also got to this point through a figure like Kant, who was, like struggling against the church, seeking to like free human beings, and I think basically establish that human beings can actually know, and that this is critical to the European Enlightenment. But then today you end up with basically like neo-Kantianism and people who have taken and so talking about the social science and over rational, and yeah, like we're not talking about years to be academic, but class. Also, I think in particular, like moment, and so where Einstein, like the 20th century, this, I guess, development of science, but also alongside war, and how science and philosophy had been interlinked, but that in this time it's sort of been abandoned for mathematics. And then I think lastly, Lenin, because when you think of philosophy, like sort of what is philosophy for? It's for science, but then also I think has very deep implications for like the organization of human society, like the possibility of human freedom. And so Lenin is kind of the end point of classical German philosophy, where he's applying Kant and Hegel to science, but that this is both social and science. And so I think this is in some ways these are maybe the key figures that one might say are like founders of like different movements of thought. But I think the Du Boisian investigation is to say like actually maybe Du Bois is the critical figure who can take all three of these further, where Du Bois is the only figure who can actually put the 20th century of Lenin into a new kind of thinking, thinking about like Russian America. And yeah, I think part of this is Du Boisian science being not just a rationalist or empirical science, but a science of the human being that takes into account law and chance, and most importantly, like sees and centers darker humanity. And so this is going to be sort of the meat, I think, of the first day, where we are trying to establish the past, but how the past, I guess, boys can only go so far and it's empty. And then the last roundtable of the day is titled The Counter-Revolution Against Cognition, Culture, and Consciousness. And so this is kind of the problems and the crisis of knowledge in Western civilization. And so we have to talk about basically at least 3 decades of counter-revolutionary attacks against thinking, against consciousness, that has been like through culture, through ideology, to especially attack like the youth, like multiple generations of young people. And so this is a roundtable where people are going to speak, I think, pretty clearly about their own experiences and what they see in various sectors of society. And so we're going to talk, I think, about arriving in America, like experiencing a different civilization, children and youth in particular, questions of manhood, I think pop culture, and this question of like what pathways are actually open to the people today, where despite like an honest striving to know the world, how is it that people are funneled and go so wrong? And that's because of basically an ideological attack or counter-revolution against thought. And yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing about the Kant. This is mainly because that one has been the most difficult to, the Kant-Einstein level. That's been the one that I've struggled most to, like, how would I describe why we're doing that panel, And I really think that it goes to the heart of even the way we titled the whole conference as Du Bois and a world movement of thought, and to center this idea that say Marxists will talk about movement of history as the motive force being economic, or I don't even know how, but the motive force being the means and relations of production. But I think we are trying to center this entire knowledge conference will try and center in some ways the forward movement of history to be seen in the movements of thought that carried history forward. And that way, I feel like what we are looking at for Western epistemology is also to say that modernity to be rejected, off the bat, just rejected as having been a failure, is not going to lead us into what needs to come next. Those movements of thought on the back of modernity was built needs to be studied, but then obvious limitations also need to be identified. And it's the Boisian movement of thought that gives us clarity on that concept. But I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. Well, because I think the panel being sandwiched between the 2 roundtables to discuss what the theological consensus is or has been, where it comes from, that relationship between the university and the state. And then I think the second roundtable trying to describe what that counter-revolution actually does, which is to attack thought itself. I think that panel that is in the middle of Kant, Einstein, and Lenin is necessary to actually say this is how we think through history. Like neither a shallow rejection and saying, oh, none of this matters, ideas don't matter, we don't need anything, which I think in some ways is kind of the activist response to say that, oh, ideas don't matter, and thus playing into basically like the university or the state's authority over ideas. But instead to like actually go deep into what ideas matter, what of it like can take us forward, and what of it like now at this point is not. I think is to like put into practice what we mean when we say that like the ideological struggle is like a political struggle.
Can I add something? I was thinking that, all that Marie was saying and like how we are seeing this panel, but also this conference, it's so much in a way a direct response to the question that you bring up when you're talking about the Mr. Ishmael interview about, movements of this time being religion-based or, secular. And I think the reason, this is even a question is because I think it is a real question. I don't think there are obvious answers that we are saying. And, I don't think we can be satisfied by just saying that, yes, religion-based movements are more popular simply because people understand or, that these move people. But I think there is something deep about this because we're having this, like we're talking about the history of movements and movement of people at a time, or
movements of a people against the basis or against a civilization, against white civilization in a way. And this is seen in the Black Freedom movement and the anti-colonial movements of the last century and so on, which all had a deep rooted idea, like it was deeply rooted in a civilizational basis. In some ways, almost it also had some form of an ancient civilizational basis, which was struggling to come into modernity. And I think the reason is because we like that like white supremacy or white modernity. It basically is the rule of a civilization, the first civilization in the history of mankind, perhaps, whose claim to supremacy is on the basis of knowledge.
Yes.
Which is why what we're trying to do is, and this is, I mean, it is reflected in what we're saying about the university, that the university is the current, it is like gatekeeper, but the university is not that different from, like from the medieval church. It's the same idea. The medieval church, coming into modernity, it claims to be, the authority towards knowledge. And I think this is something distinct that happens in Europe and then begins, which is why the idea of religion-based movement, like the way we are talking about it, is like what you were saying, like religion and like I think Emily was also saying, like the idea of black gods, not as something simply religious, but about a philosophical movement, a question of epistemology. And I think that even with Du Bois, I mean, at the same time that he's talking about like the poem that Simran read out, and how he sort of sees like freedom as essentially like in coming of the Lord and so on. But then even Du Bois also starts like he's not talking about religion in the way that white civilization thinks of as religion. He's also he comes from a place, like he starts off, I think he starts off his his career by talking about how he didn't want to go into theology and so on. He's also like he's talking about religion in a way that it cannot be separated from the question of freedom. And he brings it into the question of epistemology. And I think for this for this panel, but also this conference, I think we're trying to say that at a time when movements of people are necessarily are going to challenge the basis of a civilization, which is rooted in its authority of knowledge, movements are going to look like a different type. And I think to come back to like the reason I wanted to come in here with Kant, Einstein, and Lenin is because these are like Kant and Einstein, especially these are the figures. These form the vanguard of European thought, the high stage of European thought, and so does Lenin, forming the high stage of European thought. And these are, I think, strongly, these are figures for the movement of Europe away from the church, like away from the religion of the Catholic Church, and which is why like to bring in Du Bois here is necessary, because we're trying to understand the American people, what moves the American people, and what is the nature of the revolutionary process. Maybe not only of the American people, but of this time in the world. Sorry for the long, meandering, but I just wanted to.
No, it wasn't meandering. Can I just add on to what you're saying? I think in our planning, we talked about the 20th century and the three most important philosophical movements: dialectical materialism, logical positivism, and existentialism. Two of them, dialectical materialism and logical positivism, are philosophies of science, philosophy and science, or philosophy's connection to science. Existentialism is a movement to create a new morality, to re-examine the human being. But then in the 21st century, we see kind of a collapse of these three great movements of the 20th century. And here we are proposing Du Bois as, in some ways, a great synthesis, but in a lot of ways, something which dialectically comes out of the struggle of these schools of thought in the 20th century, producing one would existentialist claim that is to study and know man. I guess the only thing I would add to you in my essay that I'm about ready to tear is that Du Bois's claim that to know man, you must know black man, black humanity, and that he creates a creative tension with these three movements. But I think this will all come out, and I think this panel, which is the most, in some ways, the most difficult. It is a difficult panel, and of course, some people would say we should have put Hegel there, but no, I think what we have is sufficient to what we're trying to do. Why you laughing?
I'm just getting scared.
No. I have to do what I do. By the way, the Kant-Einstein thing is very, very important, I find, because of, just quickly, the time-space causality situation. Kant and Einstein are pivoting on that. And I think with Einstein, who's doing Einstein? Einstein introduces something that Kant does not. And I think, when we talk about dialectical materialism in the 20th century, we have to account for the dialectical materialist interpretation of the theory of relativity.
Okay, so then the second day.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, the second day is Du Bois and the Epoch of Humanity, and so that will be Sunday afternoon from 1 to 6 p.m. And so I think it's easy, I think, to be pessimistic, and it's very necessary, I think, to talk about the crisis and the actual problems, like the reality that we face today. But like we said in the vision statement, like we are not pessimists, like we're optimistic. And we believe that basically there is a solution that is possible if people come together and actually think things out. And so part of this is meant to be describing and discussing what we have, like what our strong hand is and where we are. And so the first panel is Du Bois and World Movements for Peace and Democracy, which is meant to, I think, establish more clearly and concretely what we mean by a world thought, where Du Bois is not a single figure, and despite him being suppressed in American thought and American discourse for most of the 20th century, we're saying that there are actually many political and ideological movements that took up Du Bois, whether it's explicit ties or also just very clear like philosophical and ideological influences. And so we had kind of thought of this like at first as a reassessment of the 20th century, where the 20th century is not just like Lenin or like, I guess like the white sense of modernity, but actually the 20th century can be understood through Bandung, Pan-African, Pan-Asia, the Black Freedom Movement, and the World Peace Movement. And so
Did we say the World Communist Movement?
Yeah, the World Peace Movement, the World Communist Movement. And so thinking of these movements, and especially the Black Freedom Movement, as movements of a new type that's based on Du Boisian thought and Du Boisian science. Talking about Bandung, the rise of Pan-African, Pan-Asia, and basically this idea of colored modernity and darker humanity. And framing Du Bois as also a theorist of the anti-colonial movement. And then I think then there's the question of Marxism, Leninism as a theory and as a practice versus as, I guess, the headlining theme of the communist movement.
Yes.
And whether it's truly Marxist-Leninist or whether it's actually very Du Boisian. And so that's the first panel. Then we're also going to have the launch of the new issue of Avant-Garde with a presentation on the Minister Ishmael interview. And some of this is to, I think, like emphasize what darker humanity is, like where we are, and critically the future. And so the last piece of programming will be a roundtable on proletarian imaginary and its futuristic vision. And so this is kind of segueing from the Minister Ishmael interview from avant-garde as a forum or a place for ideas of the people for the future. And so this roundtable is, like the broad theme is the Black proletarian imaginary. And so we want to explore sort of different areas of that thinking, whether it's music as epistemology, the question of like art and science, and of like theology and Black gods. And so this is a roundtable. I think it's meant to be kind of open-ended and somewhat speculative, where it's not as though we are saying that, oh, we're the final authorities now, but rather I think saying these are some of the things that we need to work out. And if we believe that Du Bois is the originator of a movement of thought, then parts of the most, I think, critical and new parts of his ideology are like this idea of an imaginary where art and science being linked together. That like ideas are not just, I guess, dogmatic or rationalist, but that there's an element of the human being. And yeah, that faith in the future that the Black proletarian imaginary has.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, we I think initially had called this a conference, just a kind of regular conference, but then I think we've moved towards labeling it as a research symposium, similar to the music symposium. And for us, a lot of the thinking behind how we want this event to turn out is heavily influenced by the music symposium and what we've achieved with it, especially in like really making it a forum in which it's not just like we free school presenting ideas, but we really want it to be generative and to invite all kinds of people to participate in the creation of new knowledge. And I think part of that will involve, especially on the Saturday part, like the crisis part, going deep into like kind of the deep water of like, the crisis of our time, like also the political, even the political stuff that we've talked about today with like Trump, these threats of war and everything. But then especially with the Sunday portion to come out of that, and like we say in the vision statement, to carve out of the chaos of this moment, new ways of knowing, new epistemology, a new vision of the future. And so I think that's really part of the ethos and the kind of ideological imperative that we're answering, and that we're really trying to build upon the kind of the spirit that I really felt coming out of the music symposium. And as part of that, obviously, like we're like 2 weeks away, I think at this point from, I'm less than 2 weeks away from the dogs lecture at the library. But that, so it's going to involve, you know, we're going to be moving pretty fast, and I think the pace of development of ideas is going to accelerate. And so we'll be reaching out to people to participate in different parts of the program. But I just want to say that, like, I think, like with all preschool events, like it's going to be a challenge to get on. I think it's always a challenge to just like part of it is just like getting everyone on the same page of like what we're doing. But to really be in the right kind of headspace and kind of spiritual space to really participate and be part of it, not just if you're like speaking, but even as part of the audience and discussion, because I feel like that is always really important. And simultaneously, it's like we're also trying to do the finishing last leg of like avant-garde too. And so I know that people are going to be very busy and dealing with a lot, but I think it's going to be very important for all of us to be just talking with each other, like we always do, but especially for this event. So
I just, one thing we haven't talked about and we should is who is the audience for this symposium? I know we had to try to work that out in the music symposium. I don't know. I think our audience should be very large and very broad, but as you know, it isn't often. I know we wanted to start at the Lucian Blackwell Library because, of course, the reading group there, but of course, where it's located, and it's very adjacent to the Black proletariat. But I think we should pay some attention. I don't know. I know the universities, the students are not at the universities these days. I don't, so let's think about that. I know we always want to bring children in. I think I'm going to try to mobilize my grandchildren to come, maybe on the second day. But I think we should think about who we can get to come.
And yeah, just the last, I guess, logistical thing is we just created the GoFundMe for this event, and it's to cover like the usual stuff like the church, the refreshments and food, and then also to fundraise as much as we can for this issue of awful parts. But we'll share the link for all that stuff and start going heavy on the promotion stuff now that we're getting all the major details.
Were there any more comments?
I wasn't that on top of the comments today.
Well, maybe I think the only other one was Jahan had left 2 more comments related to the Nation of Islam, where he said, I'm thinking how we put our dialogue with the Nation of Islam together with Du Bois, King, and Baldwin. I'm thinking that studying the Nation of Islam, especially the Second Resurrection, has something special to teach us about the struggle against the counter-revolution after the Civil Rights Movement and the struggle in the 21st century. Did you read it?
That's Jahan.
Yeah, Jahan said that. I think those are most of the comments. I think the other comments were people talking to each other in the chat. But maybe we could, if there's nothing else, we can finish and and then we'll see each other next week again for another free school in person.
Yes.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Online.
Jared.